The dense canopy of oak and pine loomed before me, a wall of green and brown that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. I stood at the edge of Ravenswood Forest, a sprawling woodland that had been my backyard companion for the past decade. It was late August 2023, and at 34 years old, I'd walked these trails countless times. Yet today, something felt different. The air was thick with the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth, a reminder that autumn was just around the corner. Beside me, my loyal German shepherd, Ranger, panted eagerly, his tail wagging in anticipation of our usual evening walk. I clicked his leash off, watching as he bounded a few steps ahead, nose to the ground, already on the scent of some woodland creature. "Easy, boy," I called, my voice carrying on the still air. "We've got plenty of time." As we stepped onto the well-worn path that led into the heart of Ravenswood, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. It was ridiculous, really. I knew these woods like the back of my hand. Every twist in the trail, every ancient oak, every babbling brook, they were as familiar to me as the rooms in my own house. Yet something about the quality of the light filtering through the leaves set my nerves on edge. It was 7:30 p.m., later than I usually started our walks, but the fading summer daylight should have given us at least another hour before true darkness fell. Instead, the forest seemed to be drinking in the light, the shadows between the trees deeper and more impenetrable than usual. I shook my head, trying to dispel the creeping sense of dread. "Get it together," I muttered to myself. "It's just a walk in the woods." But as we ventured deeper into Ravenswood, the silence began to press in around us. Normally, the forest would be alive with the sounds of birds calling to each other, small animals scurrying through the underbrush, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Tonight, there was nothing. It was as if the entire woodland had collectively held its breath, waiting for something. Ranger seemed to sense it too. His usual enthusiastic explorations had given way to a more cautious gait. Every few steps, he would stop and look back at me, his ears pricked forward, alert for any sound. "What is it, boy?" I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "You smell something?" As if in answer, a twig snapped somewhere off to our left, deep in the shadowy undergrowth. Ranger's head whipped around, a low growl rumbling in his chest. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding in my ears. For a long moment, we both stood stock still, straining to hear any further movement. The forest remained silent, but the air had changed. It felt charged, electrified, as if a storm were brewing. But the sky above, visible in patches through the canopy, was clear and darkening to indigo. "Come on, Ranger," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Let's keep moving." We continued down the path, but now every step felt deliberate, cautious. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Shadows danced at the corners of my vision, always disappearing when I turned to look directly at them. As we rounded a bend in the trail, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. There, carved into the trunk of an ancient oak, was a symbol I had never seen before. It looked like a crude eye, surrounded by jagged lines that could have been flames or tears. The carving was fresh, the exposed wood pale against the dark bark. I approached it slowly, my hand automatically reaching out to touch the rough surface. As my fingers brushed the carving, a jolt of something shot through me. It felt like static electricity, but colder, more invasive. I jerked my hand back, a shudder running down my spine. Ranger whined, pressing himself against my leg. His eyes were fixed on the carved symbol, his hackles raised. "It's okay, boy," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's just some stupid vandalism. Let's go home." But as I turned to head back the way we came, I realized with a sinking feeling that I no longer recognized our surroundings. The familiar landmarks I relied on to navigate Ravenswood had vanished, replaced by twisted, unfamiliar shapes in the gathering gloom. The light was fading rapidly now, much faster than it should have. Night was falling in Ravenswood, and with it came the certainty that we were no longer alone in these woods. A sound reached my ears then, faint but unmistakable. It was a whisper, carried on a non-existent breeze, speaking words in a language I didn't understand. But the meaning was clear: we didn't belong here. We weren't welcome. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, something was waiting for us. The last vestiges of daylight were rapidly fading as Ranger and I stood rooted to the spot, the carved symbol on the oak trees seeming to pulse with an otherworldly energy in the gathering gloom. My mind raced, trying to make sense of our situation. How had we become so disoriented in a forest I knew so well? The rational part of my brain insisted there must be a logical explanation, but a primal fear was slowly taking hold, whispering that we had stumbled into something beyond the realm of normal understanding. "Okay, Ranger," I said, forcing calm into my voice for both our sakes. "We need to find our way back. Come on, boy." We set off at a brisk pace, my eyes straining to make out the path in the rapidly diminishing light. The forest around us had transformed, the familiar trails and landmarks twisted into grotesque parodies of themselves. Trees that I could have sworn were never there before loomed overhead, their branches intertwining to create a claustrophobic canopy that seemed to be closing in with each step. The silence that had unnerved me earlier was now shattered by a cacophony of unsettling sounds. Twigs snapped underfoot with gunshot clarity, leaves rustled with no wind to move them, and from somewhere in the depths of the forest came a low, guttural moan that raised the hair on the back of my neck. Ranger pressed close to my side, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a nervous energy that only heightened my own anxiety. Every few steps, he would pause, ears swiveling to catch some sound beyond my human hearing range. Each time, a whine would escape him, and he urged me to move faster. As we pushed deeper into the twisted landscape of this nightmarish version of Ravenswood, the air grew thick and oppressive. It felt as if we were wading through invisible molasses, each step requiring more effort than the last. A foul odor began to permeate the air, a mixture of decay, stagnant water, and something else, something alien and indescribable that made my stomach churn. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the chill that had settled over the forest. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, and I realized I was trembling. The rational part of my mind was screaming at me to turn back, to find the way we came, but some deeper instinct propelled me forward. It was as if the forest itself was hurting us, guiding us towards some unknown destination. Suddenly, Ranger stopped dead in his tracks, a low growl rumbling in his chest. I followed his gaze and felt my heart skip a beat. There, just visible in the gloom about 20 yards ahead, was a clearing I had never seen before. At its center stood a massive, gnarled tree unlike any I had ever encountered in Ravenswood. Its trunk was easily twice the girth of the largest oaks, its bark black as pitch and seeming to writhe in the dim light. But it wasn't the tree itself that sent a spike of terror through my core. It was what surrounded it. Dozens, no, hundreds, of the same carved symbols we had seen earlier adorned every inch of its massive trunk. They seemed to glow with a faint, sickly light, pulsing in an erratic rhythm that made my head swim if I looked at them for too long. As we stood frozen at the edge of this nightmarish grove, a sound reached my ears that turned my blood to ice. It was a whisper, but not like any human voice I had ever heard. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a susurration of alien syllables that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to some primitive part of my brain. Vestigia Turrent. The voices hissed. Omnes, omnes. I didn't understand the words, but their meaning was clear. We were trespassers here, and we were not alone. Ranger's growl turned into a frightened whimper, and he began to back away, tugging at my leg. But I couldn't move. My eyes were fixed on the twisted tree, and as I watched in horror, the symbols began to shift and change, rearranging themselves into new, even more disturbing configurations. And then I saw them. Deep within the tangle of branches, 2 pinpricks of crimson light flickered to life. Eyes. Inhuman eyes that fixed upon me with an intelligence and malevolence that sent waves of terror crashing through my body. I wanted to run. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to flee, to escape this nightmare forest and never look back. But I was paralyzed, caught in the gaze of those burning red eyes like a mouse before a snake. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. The very air around us seemed to vibrate with dark energy. And slowly, with agonizing deliberation, something began to emerge from the twisted trunk of the tree. It was then that I realized the true horror of our situation. We hadn't just stumbled upon something strange in the woods. We had crossed a threshold into a place where the laws of nature no longer applied, where ancient, nameless things lurked in the shadows. And now, one of those things was coming for us. Time seemed to stretch and warp as the entity began to extricate itself from the gnarled tree. What I had initially mistaken for branches began to move with a life of their own, revealing themselves to be limbs, if such a word could be applied to the writhing, otherworldly appendages that now reached out towards us. The red eyes, burning with an intensity that seared into my very soul, never wavered from their lock on my face. I felt stripped bare, as if this thing could see every fear, every vulnerability, every dark secret I had ever harbored. And it hungered for them all. Ranger's terrified whimpers snapped me out of my paralysis. My loyal companion, who had faced down aggressive dogs and wild animals without flinching, was now trembling violently, his tail tucked firmly between his legs. The sight of my brave dog reduced to such a state of fear finally broke through the spell of terror that had gripped me. "Run!" I screamed, my voice sounding foreign and strained to my own ears. "Ranger, run!" We turned as one and bolted back the way we had come, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs with reckless abandon. The oppressive silence of earlier was now shattered by a cacophony of ungodly sounds, the creaking and groaning of trees bending in ways they were never meant to, the rustling of thousands of unseen things moving through the forest around us, and worst of all, a deep, resonant howl that seemed to shake the very ground beneath our feet. I ran blindly, branches whipping in my face and arms, roots seeming to reach up from the forest floor to trip me. Ranger stayed close, his panic panting matching my own ragged breaths. The rational part of my mind knew we were hopelessly lost, that in our panic we were likely running deeper into this twisted version of Ravenswood rather than towards safety. But primal fear had taken over, driving us forward with the desperate hope that if we just ran far enough, fast enough, we might escape the nightmare closing in behind us. The forest around us continued to transform, the trees growing more twisted and alien with each pounding step. Faces seemed to form in the bark, leering at us as we passed. Tendrils of mist curled around our legs, feeling less like water vapor and more like grasping, spectral hands trying to trip us up and drag us down. And always, I could feel those burning red eyes boring into my back. I don't know how long we ran. It could have been minutes or hours. Time had lost all meaning in this hellish landscape. But eventually, inevitably, my body began to betray me. My lungs burned, my legs trembled, and a stitch in my side felt like a hot knife with every gasping breath. I stumbled, my foot catching on an exposed root, and went down hard. The impact drove what little air remained from my lungs, and for a terrifying moment, I couldn't breathe at all. Ranger skidded to a halt beside me, his frantic barks barely registering through the fog of exhaustion and terror that enveloped me. As I lay there, struggling to draw breath into my burning lungs, I became aware of a change in our surroundings. The chaotic sounds of pursuit had faded, replaced once again by that oppressive, unnatural silence. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up onto my elbows and looked around. We had emerged into another clearing, this one dominated by a massive, flat stone that rose from the forest floor like some ancient altar. Its surface was covered in more of those alien symbols, carved deep into the rock and filled with what looked disturbingly like dry blood. But it wasn't the stone that drew my attention. It was what lay beyond it. There, not 20 feet away, stood a figure that defied description. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but that's where any resemblance to anything natural or normal ended. Its body seemed to be composed of writhing shadows, constantly shifting and reforming. Where a face should have been, there was only a swirling vortex of darkness, punctuated by those terrible, burning red eyes. As I watched, frozen once again by a terror so profound it transcended mere fear, tendrils of pure blackness began to extend from the figure's form. They reached out towards us, questing, searching, hungry for contact. Ranger's growls had subsided into pitiful whimpers. My brave, loyal dog pressed himself against my side, trembling violently. I wrapped an arm around him, as much for my own comfort as for his. The whispering started again, louder now, more insistent. Words in that same unknown language filled my head, drowning out all other thought. I felt my will begin to erode, replaced by an overwhelming urge to simply give in, to allow those shadowy tendrils to envelop me and drag me into whatever hellish realm this entity called home. It was then, in that moment of deepest despair, that something inside me snapped. A surge of defiance, born of desperation and fueled by a lifetime of stubborn determination, rose up to combat the invasive whispers. No, I growled, my voice hoarse but gaining strength. You don't belong here. This is our world, our forest. Get out. I struggled to my feet, legs shaking but holding firm. Ranger, sensing the change in me, stood as well, his hackles raised and a low growl building in his chest. The shadowy figure seemed to recoil slightly, its tendrils wavering. The whispers faltered, confusion and what might have been a flicker of fear replacing the overwhelming malevolence of before. Taking advantage of its momentary hesitation, I reached down and grabbed a rock from the forest floor. With all the strength I could muster, I hurled it at the entity, shouting wordlessly as I did so. To my shock and amazement, the rock struck true, passing through the swirling shadows and eliciting a shriek of pain and rage that threatened to split my eardrums. The figure's form began to waver and dissolve, the burning eyes flickering like dying embers. Go back to whatever hell you came from. I screamed, my voice cracking with the force of my emotions. You have no power here. With each word, I felt a surge of energy coursing through me. It was as if my defiance had tapped into some primal force, a wellspring of power that had lain dormant within me until this moment of dire need. Ranger sensed it too, his barks growing stronger and more confident as he stood his ground beside me. The shadowy entity writhed and contorted, its form becoming increasingly unstable. The burning red eyes flickered and dimmed, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope that we had won, that this nightmare was coming to an end. But then, with a sound like reality itself tearing apart, the creature let out one final, deafening shriek. The very air around us seemed to vibrate with the force of it, and I felt something warm trickle from my ears, blood, I realized with horror. In that instant of distraction, the entity made its move. With lightning speed, one of its shadowy tendrils lashed out, wrapping around my ankle with a grip like ice. I screamed in pain and terror as I felt myself being yanked off my feet, dragged towards the swirling vortex of darkness that constituted the creature's maw. Ranger, loyal to the last, lunged forward and sank his teeth into the shadowy appendage. To my amazement, his bite seemed to have an effect. The tendril writhed and recoiled, its grip on my ankle loosening just enough for me to wrench free. As I scrambled backwards, putting distance between myself and the nightmarish entity, I became aware of a change in our surroundings. The twisted, alien landscape of moments ago was starting to fade, like mist burning away in the morning sun. Through the dissipating shadows, I could see glimpses of the familiar Ravenswood I knew so well. The entity seemed to sense the change as well. Its form began to lose cohesion, the swirling shadows dispersing like smoke in a strong wind. Those terrible red eyes fixed on me one last time, and I heard a final whisper in my mind. This is not over, mortal. We will meet again. And then, with a sound like a thunderclap, the creature vanished. The oppressive atmosphere that had blanketed the forest lifted, and I found myself and Ranger standing in a perfectly ordinary clearing, bathed in the last light of a normal summer evening. For a long moment, we both stood frozen, panting heavily and trying to process what had just happened. Then, as if a spell had been broken, Ranger whined and pressed himself against my leg, looking up at me with eyes full of confusion and lingering fear. I knelt down, wrapping my arms around my faithful companion and burying my face in his fur. We stayed like that for several minutes, both of us trembling, taking comfort in each other's presence and the blessed normality of the forest around us. Finally, I stood up on shaky legs. "Come on, boy," I said, my voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. "Let's go home." As we made our way back through the now familiar trails of Ravenswood, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just experienced something that defied explanation. The rational part of my mind wanted to dismiss it all as some sort of shared hallucination, a trick of the fading light and overactive imaginations. But the lingering chill where the shadowy tendril had gripped my ankle told a different story. And deep down, I knew that our ordeal was far from over. Whatever we had encountered in the depths of Ravenswood, whatever dark force had tried to claim us, it wasn't finished with us yet. As we emerged from the forest's edge and I saw the welcoming lights of my home in the distance, I made a silent vow. I would uncover the truth behind what we had experienced. I would find out what that entity was, why it had appeared in our forest, and how to stop it from returning. The days following our harrowing encounter in Ravenswood passed in a blur of sleepless nights and paranoid days. I went through the motions of my daily life, going to work at the local library, running errands, taking care of household chores, but it all felt hollow, disconnected from reality. The mundane details of everyday existence seemed trivial in the face of what Ranger and I had experienced in those twisted woods. Every night, I would wake in a cold sweat, the echoes of alien whispers still ringing in my ears. In my dreams, I found myself back in that nightmarish version of Ravenswood, running endlessly through distorted landscapes while burning red eyes watched from every shadow. More than once, I woke to find Ranger whimpering at the side of my bed, his own sleep apparently as troubled as mine. During the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I passed a window or ventured outside, I found myself scanning the tree-line, half expecting to see a pair of crimson eyes glaring back at me. The forest that had once been a source of comfort and solace now loomed ominously, a constant reminder of the horrors that lurked just beyond the veil of normalcy. A week after our encounter, I finally worked up the courage to return to the edge of Ravenswood. I didn't dare venture past the first line of trees, but even standing there, looking into the seemingly innocent woods, I could feel a change. There was a tension in the air, a barely perceptible wrongness that set my nerves on edge. Ranger refused to even approach the forest's edge, planting himself firmly in our backyard and whining pitifully when I tried to coax him closer. It was clear that whatever had happened that night had left its mark on both of us. But as the initial shock and terror began to fade, it was replaced by a gnawing curiosity and a determination to understand what we had experienced. I began to spend my free time researching, poring over books on local history, folklore, and the occult. The library where I worked became my second home as I delved into dusty tomes and obscure journals, searching for any mention of similar encounters or entities that matched what we had seen. Most of what I found was useless, vague urban legends, clearly fictional accounts, or New Age mysticism that bore no resemblance to the very real horror we had faced. But here and there, buried in the margins of forgotten texts or hidden in the subtext of local myths, I began to find hints of something deeper. References to the Watchers in the woods cropped up in several Native American legends from the area. An old settler's diary from the early 1800s described a night of twisted shadows that had descended on the fledgling town, leaving half the population mad or missing. And in a crumbling manuscript that I had to handle with gloves for fear of it falling apart, I found a detailed account of a ritual meant to bind the dwellers beyond the veil. Each new piece of information only served to deepen the mystery and fuel my obsession. I started mapping out the locations mentioned in the various accounts, cross-referencing them with geographical surveys and historical records. A pattern began to emerge, a series of locations forming a rough circle around Ravenswood, each site apparently tied to some historical incident or local legend. As I delved deeper into my research, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being guided by some unseen force. Crucial books would fall open to exactly the page I needed, or I would stumble upon a vital piece of information just when I was about to give up for the day. It was as if something wanted me to uncover this knowledge, but whether it was for my benefit or to serve some darker purpose, I couldn't say. My obsession didn't go unnoticed. Colleagues at the library began to whisper about my strange requests and late nights poring over obscure texts. Friends called less frequently, put off by my distracted manner and reluctance to socialize. Even Ranger seemed to grow wary of my behavior, watching me with concerned eyes as I muttered to myself and covered the walls of my study with maps and notes. But I couldn't stop. The need to understand, to find some way to protect myself and my home from the malevolent force we had encountered, drove me relentlessly forward. And always, I could feel those burning red eyes watching me from the depths of my memory, a constant reminder of the stakes involved. It was about a month after our encounter in the woods that things took another dark turn. I had fallen asleep at my desk, surrounded by open books and scribbled notes, when a sound jolted me awake. It was Ranger, barking frantically from the backyard. I rushed to the window, my heart pounding. The full moon illuminated the yard in silvery light, casting long shadows across the lawn. Ranger stood at the edge of the property, his hackles raised, barking at something in the woods beyond. And there, just within the tree line, I saw it. A flicker of movement, a patch of darkness deeper than the surrounding shadows. And for just a moment, a pair of familiar, burning red eyes locked with mine. I blinked, and it was gone. But the message was clear. Whatever we had encountered in Ravenswood hadn't forgotten about us. And it was getting closer. As I stood there, staring out into the now still forest, a chill ran down my spine. I realized that my research, my quest for understanding, had attracted attention. By seeking out knowledge of these dark forces, I had inadvertently placed myself squarely in their sights. The game had changed. No longer was I simply trying to understand what had happened to us in the woods. Now, I was in a race against time, struggling to uncover the secrets of these entities before they decided to finish what they had started that night in Ravenswood. As I called Ranger back into the house, securing every lock and drawing every curtain, I knew that our lives had been irrevocably altered. The boundary between our world and whatever dark realm lay beyond had been breached, and I was now standing on the front lines of a war I barely understood. Sleep did not come easily that night, nor for many nights after. But in the darkness of my room, listening to the rustling of leaves outside my window and Ranger's uneasy whimpers, I made a decision. I would not be a passive victim in whatever cosmic game was unfolding around me. I would arm myself with knowledge, seek out allies if I could find them, and face whatever horrors awaited head-on. The weeks that followed my late-night encounter with those burning red eyes were a blur of feverish research and mounting paranoia. I took a leave of absence from my job at the library, citing personal reasons. My colleagues' concerned looks told me they suspected something was seriously wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to care. There were more important matters at hand. My house transformed into a fortress of occult knowledge. Every available surface was covered with books, maps, and hastily scribbled notes. The walls of my study disappeared behind a web of red string connecting newspaper clippings, historical accounts, and blurry photographs of supposed supernatural phenomena. To an outside observer, it would have looked like the lair of a madman. Perhaps that's exactly what it was. Sleep became a luxury I could ill afford. When I did succumb to exhaustion, my dreams were plagued by visions of twisted forests and shadowy figures with burning eyes. More than once, I woke to find myself standing at the edge of Ravenswood, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. Ranger's whines would snap me back to reality, his loyal presence the only thing keeping me tethered to sanity. It was during one of these late-night research sessions that I made a breakthrough. Buried in the footnotes of an obscure anthropological study, I found a reference to a local indigenous tribe that had inhabited the area long before European settlers arrived. The tribe, known as the Naquin, had a rich oral tradition filled with stories of entities they called the shadows between worlds. The description of these entities sent a chill down my spine. They were said to exist in the liminal spaces between our reality and others, able to slip through when the boundaries grew thin. The Naquin believed that certain locations acted as natural weak points in these boundaries, and that rituals could be performed to either strengthen the barriers or, horrifyingly, to intentionally weaken them. One such location was described as a great wood where the old ones whisper. The parallels to Ravenswood were impossible to ignore. Armed with this new information, I redoubled my efforts. I managed to track down a descendant of the Naquin people, an elderly woman named Maggie Redfeather who lived on the outskirts of town. It took days of pleading and explanations before she agreed to meet with me. The day of our meeting dawned gray and overcast, a light drizzle casting a gloomy pall over everything. As I drove to Maggie's small, weather-beaten house on the reservation, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow on the roadside seemed to move with sinister intent, and more than once I could have sworn I saw flashes of red in my rearview mirror. Maggie was waiting for me on her porch, a tiny, wrinkled figure wrapped in a colorful shawl. Her eyes, sharp and alert despite her advanced age, seemed to look right through me as I approached. "You've seen them, haven't you?" she said without preamble. It wasn't really a question. "The shadows have marked you." I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. "In the woods," I managed to croak out. "My dog and I, we saw something." Maggie sighed heavily, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and resignation. "Come inside," she said. "We have much to discuss, and little time. They know you're here." As I followed her into the dimly lit interior of her home, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Whether from the old woman's words or some other, more sinister presence, I couldn't say. But I knew, with bone-deep certainty, that I was about to learn things that would change my life forever. What Maggie told me over the next few hours shook me to my core. The shadows, she explained, were ancient beings that had existed alongside humanity since the dawn of time. They weren't inherently malevolent, but neither were they benign. They were simply other. Alien intelligences with motivations and desires beyond human comprehension. But something has changed, Maggie said, her voice dropping to a whisper. The balance has been disturbed. The shadows are growing bolder, pushing harder against the boundaries between worlds. And Ravenswood is at the center of it all. She spoke of an ancient standing stone deep in the heart of the forest, a relic from a time before recorded history. This stone, she claimed, was a linchpin holding together the fabric of reality in this area. But now, for reasons unknown, its power was waning. The shadows sense weakness, Maggie continued, her eyes darting nervously to the windows. They seek to exploit it, to push through into our world in greater numbers. And there are those who would help them. My blood ran cold at her words. Who? I demanded. Who would do such a thing? Maggie's face crumpled in sorrow. My own grandson, she whispered. He's fallen in with a group that believes they can harness the power of the shadows. They don't understand what they're dealing with. They'll doom us all. As she spoke, the light outside seemed to dim, though it was still mid-afternoon. Shadows lengthened across the floor, reaching towards us with grasping fingers. A low, thrumming vibration filled the air, just on the edge of hearing. Maggie's eyes widened in fear. They're here, she gasped. You need to leave. Now. I stumbled to my feet, my heart pounding. Through the window, I could see shapes moving in the mist that had suddenly enveloped the house. Shapes that defied natural geometry, all angles and writhing tendrils. What do I do? I asked, panic rising in my throat. Maggie pressed a small, worn book into my hands. Find this stone, she said urgently. Strengthen the boundary. It's our only hope. As I ran for my car, the world around me seemed to warp and twist. The ground beneath my feet felt unstable, as if reality itself was coming apart at the seams. And always, I could feel those burning red eyes watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. I peeled out of Maggie's driveway, tires screeching on the wet pavement. In my rearview mirror, I saw the mist engulf her house completely. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing on the porch, not Maggie, but something tall and impossibly thin, with too many limbs. Then I blinked, and it was gone. As I sped home, clutching the book Maggie had given me, I knew that time was running out. Whatever forces were at work in Ravenswood, whatever cosmic game was being played, it was approaching its endgame. And somehow, for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom, I was right at the center of it all. The drive home from Maggie's house was a nightmare of paranoia and encroaching darkness. The late afternoon sun should have still been high in the sky, but an unnatural twilight had fallen over the landscape. Shadows seemed to move independently of their sources, reaching out with grasping tendrils as I sped past. More than once, I caught glimpses of impossible things in my peripheral vision, shapes that twisted in ways that hurt to look at, flashes of red eyes peering out from the deepening gloom. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and I found myself muttering a steady stream of desperate prayers to any deity that might be listening. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat for a long moment with the engine idling, trying to gather the courage to make the short dash to my front door. The shadows between my car and the house seemed to writhe with malevolent intent, and I could have sworn I heard whispers carried on the chill wind that had sprung up. Taking a deep breath, I clutched Maggie's book to my chest and made a run for it. I fumbled with my keys, cursing under my breath as the shadows around me grew darker and more substantial. Just as I felt something cold and impossibly thin brush against the back of my neck, I managed to wrench the door open and tumble inside. I slammed the door shut behind me, engaging every lock and sliding the heavy wooden bar I had installed across it. For a moment, all I could do was lean against it, panting heavily, my heart racing in my chest. A low whine drew my attention, and I looked up to see Ranger watching me from the hallway. His tail was tucked between his legs, and his eyes were wide with fear. He could sense it too, the wrongness that had followed me home. "It's okay, boy," I said, trying to inject a confidence into my voice that I didn't feel. "We're safe now." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were a lie. The shadows in the corners of my living room seemed deeper than they should be, and there was a heaviness to the air that made it difficult to breathe. Whatever had been unleashed in Ravenswood, it wasn't content to stay confined to the forest any longer. With shaking hands, I opened the book Maggie had given me. It was old, the pages yellowed and brittle with age. The text was handwritten in a spidery script, a mixture of English and what I assumed was the Nochlin language. Detailed diagrams and unsettling illustrations filled the margins, depicting rituals and entities that made my skin crawl. As I pored over the book, the true scope of what we were facing began to dawn on me. The shadows, as Maggie had called them, were not simply monsters or demons in the traditional sense. They were something far more fundamental and terrifying, living embodiments of the spaces between realities, of the cracks in the foundation of our universe. And now, thanks to the weakening of the boundary stone in Ravenswood, they were pushing through into our world in greater numbers than ever before. The book spoke of ancient rituals and forgotten magics that could be used to strengthen the boundaries between worlds. But it also warned of the dangers involved, of the risk of attracting the attention of things far worse than the shadows if the rituals were performed incorrectly. As night fell outside, the shadows in my house grew longer and darker. I worked feverishly, transcribing passages from the book and cross-referencing them with my earlier research. Ranger paced nervously, occasionally growling at something I couldn't see. It was well past midnight when I finally pieced together what needed to be done. The boundary stone in Ravenswood needed to be recharged, its power restored to push back against the encroaching darkness. But to do so would require a ritual performed at the peak of the new moon, less than a week away. And I couldn't do it alone. With a heavy heart, I realized I would need to seek out Maggie's grandson and the group he had fallen in with. They had been working to weaken the boundary, true, but they were the only ones besides myself who might understand the gravity of the situation. As I reached for my phone to start making calls, a sound from outside froze me in place. It was a rustling, slithering noise, like something large and boneless moving through the underbrush. Ranger's hackles rose, a low growl building in his throat. Slowly, dreading what I might see, I approached the window and peered out into the darkness of my backyard. What I saw turned my blood to ice. The trees at the edge of my property, once familiar and comforting, had changed. Their branches now twisted in impossible configurations, reaching towards my house with grasping, claw-like limbs. And between them, moving with a fluidity that defied physics, were shapes of pure darkness. As I watched, paralyzed with terror, one of the shapes resolved itself into a vaguely humanoid form. It turned towards the house, and a pair of burning red eyes fixed directly on me. A voice that was not a voice echoed in my mind, a susurration of alien syllables that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to my soul. "We are coming. The boundary falls. Your world will be ours." I stumbled back from the window, my mind reeling. The game had changed. We were out of time. As I grabbed my keys and Maggie's book, shouting for Ranger to follow, I knew that the next few days would determine not just my fate, but the fate of our entire reality. The storm was gathering, darkness was encroaching, and I was the only one who stood a chance of stopping it. But first, I had to survive the night. And as the shadows outside my house grew thicker and more substantial, as the whispers in the dark grew louder and more insistent, I realized that even that simple goal might be beyond my reach. The final battle for Ravenswood, and for our world, had begun. And I was terrifyingly unprepared for what was to come. The next few days passed in a blur of frantic preparation and mounting dread. Sleep became a distant memory as I threw myself into deciphering the arcane rituals described in Maggie's book. My house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The shadows in every corner seemed to pulse with malevolent life, and the whispers that had once been confined to my dreams now followed me even in my waking hours. Ranger refused to leave my side, his constant presence both a comfort and a stark reminder of the danger we faced. His hackles would raise at random intervals, his eyes fixed on empty spaces that I knew weren't truly empty at all. But I couldn't face this alone. With great reluctance, I reached out to the one person who might be able to help, Jason Redfeather, Maggie's grandson. It took several tense phone calls and a meeting in a crowded diner, the only place I felt marginally safe, before he agreed to hear me out. Jason was everything I wasn't, young, charismatic, with an air of dangerous confidence that set my teeth on edge. He listened to my story with an unsettling gleam in his eyes, occasionally nodding as if I was confirming something he already knew. "So the old woman finally spilled her secrets," he said when I finished, a hint of bitterness in his voice. "Took the end of the world to make it happen." "This isn't a game, Jason," I hissed, leaning across the table. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. These things, they'll destroy everything if we don't stop them." Jason's smile was razor sharp. "Oh, I know exactly what we're dealing with. The question is, do you? Do you really understand the power that's there for the taking?" A chill ran down my spine. This was what Maggie had warned me about. Jason and his group didn't want to stop the shadows, they wanted to control them. "It doesn't work like that," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "You can't control them. They're not some magical power source. They're gods," Jason finished for me, his eyes shining with fervent belief. "They're gods, waiting to be awakened. And we're going to be the ones to do it." I realized then that convincing Jason to help seal the boundary was a lost cause. But I also knew I couldn't hope to perform the ritual alone. I needed his knowledge, his connections to the others who had been working to weaken the boundary. So I made a decision that I knew I might come to regret. "Fine," I said, forcing the words out. "You want to awaken your gods? I'll help you. But we do it my way, with the ritual from my book. Deal?" Jason studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Deal," he said, extending his hand across the table. As I shook it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made a pact with the devil. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Jason introduced me to his group, a motley collection of occultists, thrill-seekers, and lost souls who had been seduced by the promise of otherworldly power. We pored over my notes and Maggie's book, combining their knowledge with mine to piece together the complex ritual that would need to be performed. All the while, the sense of wrongness in Ravenswood grew stronger. Reports of strange sightings and inexplicable phenomena began to spread through the town. People spoke in hushed whispers of shadows that moved on their own, of voices in the night that spoke in inhuman tongues. The local authorities were at a loss, and an atmosphere of paranoia and fear settled over the community like a shroud. As the night of the new moon approached, Jason and I made our final preparations. We gathered the necessary components, rare herbs, crystals of impossible geometries, and other, less savory ingredients that I tried not to think too hard about. The boundary stone, Jason assured me, was deep in the heart of Ravenswood, in a clearing that could only be reached by those who knew the way. The night before the ritual, as I triple-checked our supplies and ran through the complex series of chants and gestures one last time, I felt a presence behind me. I turned to find Ranger staring intently at a dark corner of the room, a low growl building in his throat. As I watched, the shadows in that corner seemed to deepen, to take on a solidity that defied logic. And then, emerging from that impossible darkness, came a figure that haunted my nightmares. It was vaguely humanoid, but wrong in ways that hurt to look at directly. Its limbs were too long, too fluid, ending in appendages that were neither hands nor claws but something horribly in between. But it was the eyes that drew my attention, burning red orbs that fixed on me with an intelligence that was utterly alien and terrifyingly vast. "You meddle in forces beyond your comprehension, mortal," a voice that wasn't a voice echoed in my mind. "The boundary weakens. We come. Your world will be remade in our image." I wanted to run, to scream, to curl up in a ball and pray for it all to go away. But something in me, some last reservoir of courage I didn't know I possessed, made me stand my ground. "No," I said, my voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. "This is our world. You don't belong here. And I'm going to send you back where you came from." The entity's form seemed to ripple, as if my defiance had caused it physical pain. For a moment, I thought I saw something like fear in those burning eyes. Then, with a sound like reality tearing, it was gone, leaving behind nothing but the acrid smell of ozone and a bone-deep chill that no fire could warm. As Ranger pressed against my leg, whimpering softly, I knew that tomorrow night would determine the fate of everything. One way or another, this nightmare would end. I just prayed I would be strong enough to see it through. The night of the new moon dawned dark and foreboding. A palpable sense of wrongness hung in the air, as if reality itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. As I made my final preparations, packing Maggie's book and the ritual components into a backpack, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was arming myself for a war I had no hope of winning. Ranger paced nervously by the door, whining softly. I knelt beside him, burying my face in his fur. I need you to stay here, boy, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. Keep the house safe for me, okay? His brown eyes seemed to hold a depth of understanding far beyond that of a normal dog. He licked my face once, then retreated to his bed in the corner, watching me with a mixture of love and worry that broke my heart. As I stepped outside, the world seemed to twist and warp around me. The familiar streets of my neighborhood were shrouded in an unnatural mist, and shadows danced at the edge of my vision. More than once, I could have sworn I saw figures moving in the fog, tall, impossibly thin shapes that defy human geometry. Jason and his group were waiting for me at the edge of Ravenswood. There were 7 of them in total, their faces a mixture of excitement, fear, and, in Jason's case, a fervent anticipation that sent a chill down my spine. Ready to make history? Jason asked, his grin sharp in the dim light. I nodded grimly, not trusting myself to speak. As one, we turned and entered the forest. The moment we stepped beneath the trees, it was like entering another world. The air grew thick and oppressive, filled with whispers just below the threshold of hearing. The shadows between the trees seemed to move with a life of their own, reaching out with grasping tendrils that retreated just before making contact. Jason led us along a twisting path that seemed to defy the laws of geometry. We would turn left 3 times in succession, yet somehow end up traveling in a straight line. Trees that loomed ahead of us would disappear when we turned to look at them directly, only to reappear behind us moments later. As we ventured deeper into the heart of Ravenswood, the boundary between our world and the realm of the shadows grew increasingly thin. Reality itself seemed to fray at the edges, colors becoming more vivid and intense while simultaneously bleeding into one another in impossible ways. More than once, we caught glimpses of things moving in the darkness between the trees. Shapes that hurt the eye to look at directly, all angles and writhing tentacles. And always, the burning red eyes that haunted my nightmares. Finally, after what felt like hours but could have been minutes, we emerged into a large clearing. At its center stood the boundary stone, a massive monolith of black rock that seemed to absorb the light around it. Carved into its surface were symbols and glyphs that hurt to look at directly, as if they were written in a language that human minds were not meant to comprehend. Behold, Jason said, his voice filled with reverence. The gateway to our ascension. But as we approached the stone, I realized something was terribly wrong. The air around the monolith shimmered and warped, like heat haze on a summer day. And through that distortion, I could see things. Vast, incomprehensible shapes pressing against the thinning veil between worlds, eager to break through. We need to begin the ritual now, I said urgently, pulling Maggie's book from my backpack. The boundary is weaker than we thought. If we don't act quickly, dash. My words were cut off by a scream. One of Jason's followers, a young woman whose name I didn't know, was pointing at the tree lane with a look of abject terror on her face. Emerging from the shadows were figures that defied description. They were vaguely humanoid, but wrong in ways that hurt to comprehend. Their limbs were too long, too fluid, ending in appendages that were neither hands nor claws. And their faces. God, their faces were nightmares given form, all writhing tentacles and burning red eyes. The shadows, Jason breathed, his earlier confidence replaced by dawning horror. They're here. We need to form a circle around the stone, I shouted, fighting to be heard over the rising cacophony of alien whispers that filled the air. Join hands and focus on pushing them back. To their credit, Jason and his followers snapped into action. We formed a ring around the boundary stone, linking hands and beginning the complex series of chants and gestures that would strengthen the barrier between worlds. But it was like trying to hold back the tide with our bare hands. For every shadow we managed to push back, 2 more seemed to take its place. The very air around us began to crystallize, shards of impossible geometry cutting into our flesh as reality itself began to break down. I could feel the others' resolve weakening. One by one, they began to falter, their chants turning to screams as the full horror of what we faced became clear. And then Jason, his face a mask of rapturous terror, broke the circle. "No," he cried. "We can't stop them. We must embrace them. Become one with their power." Before I could stop him, he ran towards the nearest shadow, arms outstretched. The entity seemed to engulf him, its form rippling and distorting as it absorbed him into its mass. Jason's scream of ecstasy turned to one of agony, then cut off abruptly. The others, seeing their leader fall, panicked. They scattered, running blindly into the twisted landscape of Ravenswood. I heard their screams echoing through the trees, growing fainter and more distorted until they faded into silence. I was alone. The shadows closed in around me, their burning eyes fixed on me with alien hunger. I pressed my back against the boundary stone, clutching Maggie's book to my chest like a shield. "No," I said, my voice hoarse but growing stronger. "This ends now. This is our world, and you don't belong here." With shaking hands, I opened the book to the final ritual, one I had hoped I wouldn't have to use. It was a last resort, a way to seal the boundary permanently, but at a terrible cost. As I began to recite the words, my voice rising above the otherworldly howls of the shadows, I felt a surge of power coursing through me. The boundary stone began to glow, pulsing with an energy that pushed back against the encroaching darkness. The shadows recoiled, their forms wavering as they were forced back. But they rallied quickly, pressing forward with renewed determination. I could feel the strain on my mind and body as I channeled more and more power into the ritual. Blood began to trickle from my nose and ears. My vision blurred, the world around me dissolving into a swirling maelstrom of light and shadow. But still, I pressed on, forcing the words out through gritted teeth. As I neared the final verses of the ritual, I felt something within me begin to give way. This was the cost, I realized. To seal the boundary permanently would require a sacrifice, my own life force, poured into the stone to power the seal for eternity. For a moment, I hesitated. Was I really willing to give up everything, my life, my future, the chance to see Ranger again, to stop this? But then I remembered the terror in the eyes of Jason's followers as they were taken by the shadows. I thought of Maggie, of the town I called home, of all the innocent lives that would be lost if I failed. And I knew there was no choice at all. With the last of my strength, I spoke the final words of the ritual. The world around me exploded into blinding light, the boundary stone pulsing with power beyond imagining. I felt myself being torn apart at the atomic level, my very essence being drawn into the stone. The shadows shrieked in fury and despair as they were forced back, the boundary between worlds slamming shut with a finality that shook the very foundations of reality. And then, silence. I found myself floating in a void, formless, bodiless. Was this death? Or something else entirely? Slowly, awareness returned. I could feel the boundary stone beneath me, cool and solid. I could hear the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze, smell the rich scent of earth and growing things. With monumental effort, I opened my eyes. I was lying on my back in the clearing, the boundary stone looming above me. The forest around me was normal. No twisted trees, no impossible shadows. Just Ravenswood as it had always been. As I struggled to sit up, my body aching in ways I didn't know were possible, I heard a familiar bark. Turning, I saw Ranger bounding towards me, tail wagging furiously. He must have followed me, I realized. Loyal to the end. As Ranger reached me, covering my face in eager licks, I wrapped my arms around him and finally allowed myself to break down. I wept for Jason and his followers, for the terror we had faced, for the narrow brush with oblivion. But mostly, I wept with relief. It was over. We had won. As the first rays of dawn began to filter through the trees, I slowly got to my feet. The boundary stone stood silent and inert, its surface now smooth and unmarked. The book Maggie had given me was gone, its knowledge and power expended in the final ritual. With Ranger at my side, I began the long walk home. I knew that life would never be the same. How could it be, after what I had seen and done? But I also knew that as long as there were those willing to stand against the darkness, there was hope. The summer of 1998 started like any other at my grandparents' cabin near the Canadian border in northern Minnesota. I was 12 that year, old enough to take on more responsibilities but still young enough to be frightened by the vast wilderness that surrounded our family retreat. The cabin itself was a sturdy structure built in the 1950s, with its cedar siding telling stories of countless storms weathered, its windows gleaming like careful eyes watching the forest beyond. Our family had been coming here for generations, maintaining traditions that seemed as permanent as the ancient pines towering above us. One such tradition was fishing, not just the act itself, but the entire ritual surrounding it. Every morning, we'd wake before dawn, load our gear into the aluminum boat, and head out onto the mirror-smooth lake. My grandfather, Thomas, would always say the early hours were when the big ones bite, though I suspect now it was more about the peace of those morning moments. The cleaning station sat at the edge of the property, a simple wooden table with a drain board and a hose connection. It was here that my grandfather taught me the proper way to clean fish, his weathered hands guiding mine as we removed scales and separated meat from bone. But there was one rule that was absolutely unbreakable. All fish remains had to be disposed of at the designated dumping ground, deep in the woods, far from the cabin. 250 yards minimum, my grandfather would remind me constantly. Bears have better noses than you believe, and we don't want them getting comfortable around the cabin. The dumping ground itself was a natural depression in the earth, partially hidden by thick undergrowth. Years of use had created a peculiar ecosystem there. Small scavengers would clean up most of the remains overnight, and the soil had taken on a dark, rich quality that supported unusually lush vegetation. During the day, it was just another part of the forest. But as I would soon learn, places can change their nature when darkness falls. That fateful day began ordinarily enough. We had an exceptional catch, 5 good-sized northern pike and a couple of walleye that my grandmother would transform into a feast. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, my grandfather handed me the bucket of fish remains. "Think you can handle the dumping run today?" he asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You've been doing it with me all summer, and you know the trail well enough." I straightened up, proud to be trusted with this responsibility. "Of course," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The woods were different at dusk, but I wasn't about to admit that to anyone. My grandmother spoke up from the cabin porch, her voice carrying a note of concern. "Thomas, it's getting late. Maybe we should wait until morning?" "He'll be fine," my grandfather assured her. "The trail's clear, and he's got daylight left. Just follow the markers, boy, and come straight back. No detours." The markers he referred to were small reflective tags nailed to trees every 20 yards or so, creating a visible path through the woods to the dumping ground. During the day, they were hardly necessary, but as the light faded, they became crucial navigational aids. I hefted the bucket, its contents sloshing unpleasantly, and started down the trail. The weight of the bucket forced me to stop every few yards to switch hands, but I was determined to complete this task independently. The forest was already beginning to transform around me, daylight bleeding away like water through cupped hands. The first sign that something was wrong came about halfway to the dumping ground. The familiar reflective markers seemed farther apart than usual, and the trail itself appeared different, narrower, more overgrown. Still, I pressed forward, attributing the changes to the growing darkness and my own nervousness. It wasn't until I reached a fallen birch tree that I hadn't seen before that the reality of my situation began to sink in. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, wandering onto one of the many game trails that crisscrossed the forest. The realization sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. I stopped, forcing myself to think rationally as panic threatened to overwhelm me. The sun was now just a memory, with only a faint glow in the western sky providing any natural light. The forest had come alive with evening sounds, the haunting calls of whippoorwills, the rustle of nocturnal creatures emerging from their daytime retreats, the creaking of trees in the gentle breeze. Turning around, I tried to retrace my steps, but in the growing darkness, every path looked the same. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching like gnarled fingers across the darkening sky. The bucket of fish remains felt heavier with each step, and the sickly sweet smell of decay began to permeate the air. The moment I realized I was truly lost, time seemed to slow down. The forest, which had been my playground all summer, suddenly became an alien landscape. Every shadow held potential threats, every sound carried menacing undertones. The bucket of fish remains now felt like a beacon, advertising my presence to every predator in the area. I remembered my grandfather's warnings about the local wildlife, not just the bears, but the wolves, and most terrifyingly, the cougars that had been increasingly spotted in the area. These big cats were especially active at dusk, and they were known for their stealth and patience. The sound came without warning, a crack of breaking branches somewhere in the darkness to my right. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Another sound followed, this one closer, the soft thud of something heavy moving through the underbrush. Time seemed to crystallize in that moment. The darkness pressed in around me like a physical force, and the smell of rotting fish seemed overwhelming. I stood perfectly still, remembering everything I'd ever been told about encounters with predators. Don't run. Make yourself look big. Make noise. But all that wisdom evaporated when I heard it, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't the grunt of a bear or the howl of a wolf. It was something else entirely, something that spoke to the most primitive part of my brain and screamed one word: danger. What happened next remains burned into my memory with perfect clarity. The sound of movement suddenly accelerated, accompanied by the distinctive sound of claws on bark. Something was coming, and it was coming fast. The paralysis that had held me broke, and I ran. I abandoned the bucket, its contents spilling across the forest floor as I fled. The trail, such as it was, disappeared beneath my feet as I crashed through the undergrowth. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but terror drove me forward with an energy I didn't know I possessed. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit continued. Whatever was following me moved with a fluid grace that my panicked flight couldn't match. It seemed to be toying with me, sometimes falling behind, only to crash through the vegetation closer than before, hurting me in some unknown direction. The logical part of my mind tried to make sense of what was happening. Cougars don't typically chase their prey this way. Bears make more noise. Wolves hunt in packs. But logic had no place in this primal game of survival. All that mattered was the next step, the next breath, the desperate need to escape. Time lost all meaning. I could have been running for minutes or hours. My lungs burned, my legs trembled, and still I ran. The darkness was almost complete now, broken only by occasional glimpses of moonlight through the canopy above. Salvation came in the form of a familiar reflective marker, glimpsed through the trees. Somehow, in my blind panic, I had run in a rough circle and was approaching the main trail from a different angle. The sight of that small, shining rectangle gave me a surge of renewed energy. Breaking through the underbrush onto the main trail, I turned toward the cabin and ran as I had never run before. The sounds of pursuit changed character. There was a frustrated quality to them now, as if my pursuer knew its opportunity was slipping away. The main trail was wider, better maintained, and familiar even in the darkness. Each reflective marker I passed was a small victory, a countdown to safety. The sounds behind me grew fainter, then ceased altogether, but I didn't slow down. Some instinct told me that safety wasn't guaranteed until I reached the cabin's light. When I finally burst out of the tree line into the clear area around the cabin, I was sobbing for breath. The porch light was on, and I could see my grandparents' silhouettes through the windows. They had been watching for me, probably growing more worried with each passing minute. My grandfather found me collapsed on the porch steps, unable to speak through my gasping breaths. My grandmother brought water and a blanket, while I tried to explain what had happened between gulps of air. They listened without interruption, exchanging glances that I couldn't interpret. The next morning, my grandfather and 2 other men from nearby cabins went to investigate. They found the spilled bucket and, more disturbingly, tracks. Large cougar prints circled the area where I had first heard the sounds, and they followed my chaotic path through the woods. But there was something else, something that made the men fall silent and exchange troubled looks. Some of the tracks didn't match any animal they knew. They were too large for a cougar, shaped wrong for a bear, and showed signs of something that shouldn't have been possible in that terrain. My grandfather returned to the cabin that afternoon looking older than I'd ever seen him. He sat me down and made me promise never to go into those woods alone again, especially not at dusk or night. The fish dumping ground was relocated closer to the cabin, despite the risk of attracting bears. That was 26 years ago. I'm a grown man now, with children of my own, but I've never forgotten that night. The cabin still stands, though my grandparents are long gone. We still visit every summer, maintaining the family traditions, but some things have changed. The fish cleaning station has been moved closer to the cabin, with proper disposal methods that don't require trips into the woods. The old dumping ground has been reclaimed by the forest, though no one goes there anymore. The reflective markers along that section of trail have all disappeared, one by one, over the years. Sometimes, on summer evenings when the light is failing and the woods grow dark, I sit on the cabin porch and listen to the forest sounds. Most nights, it's just the normal chorus of wildlife, birds, insects, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. But occasionally, when the moon is right and the wind drops to nothing, I hear something else. A sound that makes my heart race and my palms sweat, just as they did that night so long ago. It comes from deep in the woods, from the direction of the old dumping ground, a low, rumbling sound that speaks to something primitive in the human mind. On those nights, I make sure all the doors are locked, the windows are secured, and everyone is safely inside before darkness falls completely. Because I learned something important that night all those years ago, sometimes the things we fear in the darkness are real, and some territories are best left unclaimed by human endeavor. The forest keeps its secrets, and some of them are better left undisturbed. A thick, unnatural mist writhed through the eucalyptus trees like ghostly fingers as I shouldered my backpack, my hands trembling slightly as I checked one last time that I had enough water for the day's hike. Something about the fog felt wrong, too dense, too purposeful in the way it seemed to curl around certain trees while avoiding others. It was March 1992, and I was 23 years old, still new to Australia and eager to explore every corner of this vast wilderness. My hiking companion, Ben, was already several paces ahead, his experienced steps finding purchase on the uneven trail that wound through the Belanglo State Forest. We had chosen this particular track because it promised to be challenging yet manageable for a day hike. The forest, located in New South Wales about 2 hours southwest of Sydney, was a popular spot for both locals and tourists. The morning air was crisp, carrying that distinctive Australian bush scent, a mixture of eucalyptus, dried leaves, and earthy undertones that I come to associate with adventure. What we didn't know then was that we were walking through what would soon become known as one of Australia's most notorious killing grounds. The forest held secrets, dark and terrible ones, that would haunt me for decades to come. As we ventured deeper into the bush, the sunlight filtered through the canopy in dappled patterns, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that belied the horrors that lay hidden beneath the surface. The trail meandered through groves of towering eucalyptus, their pale trunks reaching skyward like ancient sentinels. Ben pointed out various native plants and wildlife signs as we walked, his knowledge of the Australian wilderness far surpassing my own. I was still learning to distinguish between the different species of trees and the many unique birds that called this forest home. It was around midday when we veered slightly off the main trail. Ben had spotted what he thought might be a wallaby track, and we were both keen wildlife photographers. The undergrowth was thicker here, the shadows deeper despite the high sun. That's when we saw it, a structure that seemed both deliberate and out of place. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a natural formation of rocks. But as we drew closer, the deliberate arrangement became unmistakable. Flat stones had been carefully stacked to create what looked like a crude platform or altar. The rocks were weathered, but their placement was too precise to be natural. Each stone had been selected for its size and shape, fitted together with an attention to detail that spoke of purpose rather than chance. I remember feeling an inexplicable sense of unease. Something about the structure felt wrong, though I couldn't articulate why. Ben approached it with curiosity, but I held back, struck by an overwhelming urge to leave. The surrounding bush had fallen silent, no bird calls, no rustle of small animals. Just the whisper of wind through the trees and the sound of our own breathing. Looking back, I realize now that the wildlife had been trying to tell us something, their silence a warning we were too naive to understand. Months passed, and I had almost forgotten about our discovery in the forest. Then, in September 1992, the news broke. A jogger had discovered human remains in Belanglo State Forest. The police investigation that followed would uncover one of the most horrific series of crimes in Australian history. Each new revelation brought back vivid memories of that day in the forest, of the stone altar that had filled me with such inexplicable dread. I watched the news with increasing horror as more bodies were found. Each discovery was accompanied by descriptions of crime scenes that bore haunting similarities to what Ben and I had stumbled upon. The investigators described ritual-like arrangements of rocks near several of the shallow graves, makeshift altars that the killer or killers had constructed. The methodical placement of these structures suggested a level of premeditation that chilled me to my core. When they showed footage of one of these sites on a current affairs program, my blood ran cold. The stone platform was identical to the one we'd found. The realization that we had unknowingly stood at what may have been a killer's ceremonial site made me physically ill. I couldn't stop thinking about how close we might have been to active crime scenes, or worse, whether we had been observed during our unwitting intrusion. The investigation intensified throughout 1993. 7 bodies were eventually discovered in Belanglo State Forest, all young backpackers who had been brutally murdered. The victims had been bound, shot, and stabbed. Some showed signs of torture. The methodical nature of the killing suggested a level of planning that was terrifying to contemplate. Each new detail that emerged seemed to confirm my worst fears about what that stone altar might have represented. I couldn't stop thinking about that day in the forest. How close had we been to active kill sites? Had the killer been watching us? The questions haunted my dreams. I began researching similar cases, trying to understand the significance of the stone altars. What I found only deepened my horror. The positioning of the altars suggested they weren't just random structures. They appeared to serve some purpose in the killer's ritual, always placed within a specific distance from the burial sites. The thought that these carefully constructed platforms might have been part of the murderer's ceremony was almost too terrible to contemplate. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that understanding their significance might be crucial to understanding the full scope of the crimes. I spent countless hours poring over news reports, criminal psychology texts, and anything else that might shed light on the meaning behind these mysterious structures. In 1994, the breakthrough came. Police arrested Ivan Milat, a road worker who lived on the outskirts of the forest. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Weapons, camping equipment, and personal items belonging to the victims were found in his home. But it was the details about the crime scenes that struck me most forcefully. The investigators believed that Milat hadn't worked alone. The positioning of bodies, the construction of the altars, and certain aspects of the crime suggested the involvement of at least one other person. This theory sent chills down my spine, not only because it meant there might be another killer still at large, but because it cast our forest encounter in an even more terrifying light. The trial revealed horrific details about the murders. Each victim had been subjected to what the prosecution called playing with their prey, a level of torment that demonstrated not just violence, but a disturbing desire to prolong suffering. The altars, it emerged, may have been places where the killer or killers stood to watch their victims' final moments. As Milat's trial progressed, I became obsessed with understanding the significance of the stone platforms. I interviewed forensic psychologists, spoke with investigators off the record, and delved into research about ritual behavior in serial killings. What emerged was a pattern more disturbing than I had initially imagined. The altars were unique to the Belanglo murders. Similar structures had been found at other crime scenes across Australia, though none had been definitively linked to Milat or his supposed accomplice. One retired detective shared his theory that the platforms served as viewing stations, elevated positions from which the killer or killers could survey their handiwork. But others suggested more ritualistic purposes, pointing to the precise measurements between the altars and graves and the careful selection of stones used in their construction. The implications were staggering. Either there were more killers out there using the same signature, or the practice had some deeper, unknown significance. Even after Milat's conviction and life sentence in 1996, questions remained. The most troubling was the identity of his suspected accomplice. Police had several theories but never enough evidence to make an arrest. The thought that someone who had participated in these horrific crimes might still be free haunted both the investigators and the public. I often wondered about that day in the forest. Had we been watched? Had our discovery of the altar placed us in danger? The statistics showed that most of the victims had been taken in pairs, just as Ben and I had been hiking that day. The parallel was too close for comfort. The forest itself became a source of dark tourism, drawing those fascinated by the macabre. But for those who knew its secrets, who had walked its trails before the horrors were revealed, it remained a place of shadows and whispered fears. The eucalyptus trees held their secrets, and the wind through their leaves sometimes seemed to carry echoes of past terrors. Today, more than 30 years later, I still can't shake the memory of that stone altar in the forest. The case changed how Australians viewed their beloved bush, no longer just a place of adventure and natural beauty, but also a potential hiding place for unspeakable evil. The investigation into Milat's possible accomplice continues, though leads have grown cold. Sometimes I wonder if somewhere in Australia, another hiker might stumble across a carefully arranged platform of stones, not knowing its terrible significance. The Belanglo State Forest remains a popular destination for hikers and campers, though few venture far from the marked trails now. The stone altars have been dismantled, the crime scenes long since cleared, but the forest remembers. And for those of us who walked those paths in ignorance, who came face to face with the evidence of evil without recognizing it, the horror never truly fades. The case taught me something about the nature of fear, how it can exist alongside us, invisible until the moment of revelation. How ordinary places can harbor extraordinary horrors, and how the line between an adventure and a nightmare can be as thin as the edge of a carefully placed stone. The true terror lies not just in what happened, but in what remains unknown. Somewhere out there, someone knows the full story of those altars, the real meaning behind their construction, and the complete truth about what happened in Belanglo State Forest. Until those answers come to light, the mystery of the stone altars remains a dark chapter in Australia's history, a reminder that sometimes the most frightening things are those that lurk just beyond our understanding. The forest may appear peaceful now, but beneath its serene surface lies a history that continues to haunt those who know its secrets. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the eucalyptus trees, I can't help but wonder if somewhere in the vast Australian wilderness, another stone altar stands waiting, its purpose known only to those who built it. October 15, 2019. The decision to push forward as darkness fell would haunt me for years to come. I was 32 then, young enough to still believe in my own invincibility but old enough to know better. The Wallowa Mountains of eastern Oregon stretched before us like ancient sleeping giants, their peaks disappearing into the gathering gloom of dusk. My companions were Samuel and Ben, friends from my days working at the Forest Service. We'd planned this trip for months, aiming to reach Thunder Lake before winter made the trek impossible. The lake sat in a remote basin at 8,500 feet, and October meant we were racing against both daylight and weather. "We should make camp," Samuel said, adjusting his pack as we paused at a switchback. The sun had already slipped behind the ridgeline, painting the sky in deepening shades of purple. The temperature was dropping fast. I checked my GPS. We're only 2 miles from the spot I marked. The terrain levels out there, perfect for camping. The words came out in small clouds of vapor. Ben, our most experienced mountaineer, studied the darkening trail ahead. I don't like it. Weather report mentioned possible snow tonight. In these conditions, 2 miles could take twice as long as normal. I should have listened to them. Instead, I pressed on with the stubbornness that comes from summit fever, that irrational drive to reach a designated point regardless of conditions. We've got headlamps. The trail's well marked. 2 miles, guys. Then we'll have tomorrow to bag the peak without a long approach. They exchanged glances, a silent conversation born from years of friendship. Finally, Ben nodded. Your call. But we moved fast, stay together, and if conditions worsen, we turned back immediately. We adjusted our headlamps and continued upward. The forest pressed in around us, lodgepole pines creaking in the rising wind. Our breath came harder in the thin air as we climbed, and the sound of our boots crunching on rocky soil seemed unnaturally loud in the growing darkness. Looking back, I can pinpoint this moment as when everything changed. Not just the immediate events that would unfold that night, but something deeper, my fundamental understanding of wilderness, of darkness, and of our place in the natural world. The mountains had always been my sanctuary, a place of challenge but also of peace. I never imagined they could become something else entirely. The first hour passed in focused silence. We maintained a steady pace, our headlamp beams cutting through the darkness like searching fingers. The temperature continued to drop, and I could feel ice crystals forming in my beard. The wind picked up, bringing with it the first few flakes of snow. The trail narrowed as we gained elevation, hugging the side of a steep slope. Screefield stretched above us, disappearing into darkness. Below, the valley floor was lost in shadow. Our world had contracted to the small bubbles of light from our headlamps and the sound of our own labored breathing. Samuel was leading when it happened. His sudden stop sent Ben and me stumbling to avoid collision. "Oh God," he whispered, the words barely audible over the wind. 20 yards ahead, twin points of greenish-yellow light hung in the darkness. They were at about chest height, completely motionless, and fixed directly on us. My first thought was retroreflective trail markers, but these lights had an organic quality. They seemed to have depth, to hold intelligence. Mountain Lion then breathed, slowly reaching for his bear spray. The eyes remained locked on us, unblinking. Then, with deliberate slowness, they lowered toward the ground. The movement was smooth, predatory, and entirely too calculated. Every survival instinct screamed danger. "Hold together," Ben commanded, his voice steady despite the situation. "Lights on it. Make noise." We spread out slightly, creating a wider front while maintaining close proximity. The strategy with mountain lions is to appear large and aggressive. They prefer ambush attacks on lone targets. 3 adult males with bright lights should theoretically give even a hungry cat pause. I fumbled with my trekking poles, hands shaking from more than just cold. The eyes remained low, still fixed on us. Snow was falling more heavily now, the flakes catching in our headlamp beams like static. "Hey!" Ben shouted, his voice echoing off the mountainside. "Get out of here!" The eyes didn't move. We took several careful steps forward, bear spray ready, trying to get a better look. The tension was unbearable. Every muscle in my body was coiled tight, ready to react to an attack that felt inevitable. Then we saw it, just a deer, its head lowered to graze while maintaining its unblinking stare in our direction. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. We laughed, the sound slightly hysterical, releasing pent-up fear. "Jesus," Samuel muttered, lowering his bear spray. I nearly had a heart attack. The deer continued to watch us, unnaturally still except for its slowly moving jaw. Something about its behavior seemed off, but I attributed it to our presence disrupting its normal patterns. We were, after all, the intruders here. We pressed on, our brief encounter with the deer already becoming an amusing story to share later. The snow was falling steadily now, reducing visibility and making the trail treacherous. After another 40 minutes of careful hiking, we reached the relatively flat area I identified for camping. It was a small basin, partially sheltered from the wind by a natural rock formation. A few stunted whitebark pines provided additional protection. We worked quickly to set up camp, the routine familiar despite the challenging conditions. "That deer really had us going," I said as we secured the tent guy lines. Though I could have sworn its eyes were higher when we first saw them. Ben paused in his work, giving me a strange look. "They were. That's what made me think mountain lion at first." He resumed hammering a stake into the frozen ground. Probably just the angle of the slope playing tricks with perspective. Samuel emerged from the tent where he'd been arranging sleeping bags. "Did anyone else think it was weird how it just stood there?" "I've never seen a deer act like that before." We discussed it while preparing a quick meal of freeze-dried stroganoff. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and the snow was accumulating rapidly. Our breath froze in our beards, and the water in our bottles was starting to form ice. "We should do watch rotations tonight," Ben suggested, scraping the last of his dinner from his pot. "This weather's getting serious, and we're in prime predator territory." I agreed, though I didn't voice the growing unease in my gut. Something about the deer's behavior kept nagging at me. Wild animals often act strangely around humans, but this had felt different, almost staged, like a performance. We set up 2-hour watch rotations, with Samuel taking first watch, me second, and Ben third. The plan was to start hiking at first light, summit the peak if conditions allowed, and then make our way back to the trailhead. As I crawled into my sleeping bag, the wind howled through the trees with an almost vocal quality. I told myself it was just the weather, just the normal sounds of wilderness at night. But as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Samuel woke me from my watch at midnight. The storm had intensified, wind battering the tent walls like an angry beast trying to get in. He looked rattled. "Everything okay?" I asked, pulling on my down jacket. "Yeah," he said quickly, too quickly. "Just cold. And the wind's making weird noises." He hesitated. "I kept thinking I saw things moving out there, but it's probably just snow and shadows." I grabbed my headlamp and climate-appropriate gear, then took up position in our tent's vestibule where I could watch our surroundings while staying relatively protected from the elements. The temperature display on my watch read -12 degrees Celsius, 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind chill made it feel much colder. The first hour of my watch passed uneventfully. The storm created an endless play of shadows as snow swirled through my headlamp beam. Occasionally, a particularly strong gust would shake loose a load of snow from the trees, creating phantom movements in the darkness. Then I saw it, a shadow darker than the surrounding night, moving with purpose between the trees. My headlamp caught it for just a moment before it disappeared, a large, low-slung shape that definitely wasn't a deer. My heart rate spiked. I reached for the bear spray, trying to control my breathing. Mountain lions are ambush predators. They don't typically stalk humans openly unless desperately hungry or sick. But as I played my light across the trees, I saw nothing but falling snow and wind-whipped branches. The second hour of my watch became an exercise in psychological warfare. Every shadow seemed to hide a predator. Every sound carried menace. I found myself obsessively checking and rechecking the perimeter of our camp, jumping at the smallest disturbance. Just before 2 a.m., I heard it, a sound distinct from the wind and creaking trees. A soft crunch of snow under weight, deliberate and careful, circling our position. I played my light in the direction of the sound but saw nothing. The crunching continued, moving around us, always just beyond where my light could reach. I wanted to wake Ben early for his watch, but pride kept me silent. I was an experienced outdoorsman, not some rookie spooked by their first night in the backcountry. Still, by the time I woke Ben at 2 a.m., my nerves were frayed raw. "All quiet?" he asked, pulling on his boots. I hesitated. "Mostly. Thought I saw something moving out there." "Probably nothing." Ben nodded, but I noticed how his hand went to the knife on his belt. "Get some rest. We've got a long day tomorrow." Sleep proved elusive. Every gust of wind, every creak of the tent fabric jolted me awake. I dozed fitfully, plagued by half-formed dreams of glowing eyes and shadowy pursuers. When Ben shook me awake at first light, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. The storm had passed, leading behind a transformed landscape. 8 inches of fresh snow covered everything, smoothing out the rough terrain into gentle curves and hollows. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. "You need to see this," Ben said quietly, his face grim. "Both of you." We pulled on our boots and outer layers, then followed Ben to the edge of our campsite. In the pristine snow, a set of tracks circled our tent, huge, distinctive prints that made my stomach clench. "Mountain lion," Samuel whispered, crouching to examine them more closely. "Big one." The tracks told a story that made my blood freeze. The cat had indeed circled our camp for hours, sometimes coming within feet of the tent. But there was something else, something that didn't make sense. The tracks showed the cat had walked in perfect circles around us, over and over, with a precision that seemed almost ritualistic. "This isn't normal behavior," Ben said, his expertise with wild animals evident in his tone. "They don't do this. They either attack or they don't." We followed the tracks further. They led away from camp and back toward the trail we'd come up the night before. That's when Samuel called out, "Guys, there's something else here." About 50 yards from camp, we found another set of tracks overlapping the mountain lions. These were smaller, rounder deer tracks. But they followed the exact same circular pattern as the cats, as if the deer had traced the predator's path with impossible precision. "This isn't possible," I muttered, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "A deer couldn't." "We need to get out of here," Ben said firmly. "Now. Forget the summit, forget everything else. We pack up and we go." No one argued. We returned to camp and began breaking everything down with efficient haste. The sun was fully up now, revealing a beautiful winter morning that felt like a mockery of our fear. As we shouldered our packs, Samuel pointed back toward the trail. "Should we be worried about running into them?" Ben checked his bear spray and knife. "We stay together. Make noise. Keep aware. Whatever's going on here, I don't want to find out more about it." The hike down started normally enough. Fresh snow made the trail slippery, but our microspikes provided adequate traction. We maintained a brisk pace, eager to put distance between ourselves and whatever strange events had transpired overnight. About a mile down, we reached the spot where we'd encountered the deer the previous evening. All 3 of us slowed, unconsciously drawing closer together. The snow covering the trail was pristine except for our own tracks coming down. No deer prints, no cat prints, nothing to suggest the strange circular patterns we'd found at our camp. But something wasn't right. The smell hit us first, a heavy, metallic odor that cut through the clean mountain air. Then we saw the blood, dark patches staining the fresh snow beneath a lone white-bark pine. What remained of the deer was scattered across 20 yards of trail and surrounding forest. The violence of the attack was evident in the way the carcass had been torn apart, but something was off about it. The dismemberment seemed too systematic, almost surgical in its precision. "This isn't right," Ben said, examining the scene with professional detachment. "Mountain lions don't feed like this. They drag their kill to cover and carefully consume it. This looks more like..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. We all saw what he meant. The deer hadn't been eaten, it had been deliberately torn apart, its pieces arranged in a pattern that became apparent the longer we looked at it. The same circular pattern we found in the tracks around our camp. "We need to move," I said, fighting down rising panic. "Now." We quickened our pace, no longer concerned about stealth or noise. The temperature was rising with the sun, causing the snow to start melting and making the trail treacherous. Twice we slipped and fell, but fear drove us forward. The forest felt different in daylight, but not in a comforting way. Shadows seemed deeper than they should be, and shapes between the trees drew our eyes without revealing themselves fully. The wind had died completely, leaving an unnatural silence broken only by our labored breathing and the crunch of snow under our boots. Then we heard it, a scream that started as something recognizably feline but transformed into something else, something that shouldn't exist in nature. It came from behind us, too close for comfort but far enough that we couldn't see its source. We ran. Running with full packs on a snow-covered mountain trail is incredibly dangerous. Under normal circumstances, none of us would have considered it. But fear overrode our training and experience. The sound came again, closer this time. It had changed. Now it mimicked a deer's distress call, but wrong somehow, as if something was trying to approximate the sound without quite getting it right. We reached a switchback and paused briefly to catch our breath. That's when we saw it, moving through the trees parallel to the trail, a shape that seemed to shift between feline and cervine, never quite settling on either form. "Don't look at it," Ben commanded, his voice shaking despite his attempt at control. "Just move." We continued down the trail as fast as we dared. The thing in the trees kept pace, occasionally visible in our peripheral vision but never clear enough to properly see. It moved in impossible ways, flowing around trees rather than running past them. The sun had risen high enough to start melting the snow, making the trail even more treacherous. Water dripped from the trees, and patches of mud appeared beneath the snow. Our boots lost traction repeatedly, leading to falls that left us bruised and scraped. The thing hurted us, I realized with growing horror. Whenever we tried to stop or slow down, that terrible scream would sound from behind us, driving us forward. When we tried to move too fast, it would appear ahead of us, forcing us to change pace. It was playing with us. Samuel fell hard on a particularly slick section of trail, his ankle twisting with an audible pop. We helped him up, but he could barely put weight on the injured limb. "Leave me," he gasped through clenched teeth. "I'll only slow you down." "Not happening," Ben and I said almost simultaneously. We positioned ourselves on either side of him, supporting his weight between us. The creature screamed again, the sound now a horrible mixture of cat, deer, and something almost human. It was definitely closer. Our descent became a nightmare of pain and fear. Samuel's injured ankle slowed us considerably, and each step clearly caused him agony despite our support. Sweat froze on our faces despite the rising temperature, and our muscles burned from the awkward three-person shuffle we'd been forced to adopt. The creature's behavior changed as the sun rose higher. It became more aggressive, its manifestations more frequent and closer to the trail. We could hear it moving through the underbrush on both sides now, as if it had somehow split into multiple entities. The sounds it made grew increasingly complex, layered vocalizations that seemed to combine every animal in the forest into an impossible chorus. About 2 miles from the trailhead, we encountered other hikers heading up, a group of 4 equipped for day hiking. They seemed shocked by our appearance, 3 grown men, wild-eyed and disheveled, helping an injured companion down the trail. "Turn back," Ben warned them between heavy breaths. "The trail's not safe." They started asking questions, but a scream from the forest, closer than ever, cut them off. I'd never seen people change direction so quickly. The encounter seemed to enrage our pursuer. The screams became nearly continuous, and we could hear branches breaking as something large moved rapidly through the forest parallel to us. The shifting shadow appeared more frequently in our peripheral vision, each glimpse revealing a form that seemed to defy physical laws. We were nearly running now despite Samuel's injury, half carrying him between us. The pain must have been excruciating, but he didn't complain. Perhaps he sensed, as we all did, that our lives depended on maintaining our pace. The forest thinned as we lost elevation, morning sunlight penetrating more fully through the canopy. Our pursuer's screams took on a frustrated quality, and its appearances grew less frequent. When we finally broke into the open area near the trailhead, the sound ceased entirely. We didn't stop until we reached our vehicle. Only then, with doors locked and engine running, did we allow ourselves to look back at the forest we just fled. The tree line appeared normal, peaceful even, in the late morning sun. No sign remained of the terror we just experienced. The drive back to civilization was silent except for Samuel's occasional grunts of pain. We took him directly to the emergency room, where x-rays confirmed a severe sprain rather than a break. The doctor asked how the injury occurred. "Slipped on some ice," Samuel said. We all nodded in agreement. What else could we say? Who would believe the truth? That was 5 years ago. I'd like to say we've moved past it, that we've found some way to rationalize what happened on that mountain. We haven't. Samuel recovered from his ankle injury but never returned to hiking. He took a job in Seattle and rarely ventures out of the city now. Ben still works for the Forest Service but requested a transfer to public education and outreach. He no longer does field work. I continued hiking for a while, but only on populated trails and never after dark. Then, 3 months ago, I saw something that forced me to stop altogether. I was on a popular trail near Mount Hood, broad daylight, dozens of other hikers around. A deer stepped out of the forest about 50 yards ahead. It stood perfectly still, watching me with unblinking eyes. Then, just for a moment, its form seemed to shift and flow, becoming something else before returning to deer shape. No one else on the trail seemed to notice anything unusual. The deer eventually turned and walked back into the forest, moving with that same impossible fluidity I remembered from that night in the Wallowas. I turned around and left the trail. I haven't been back to the mountain since. August 12, 2020. The Appalachian summer hung heavy in the air as my wife Isabella and I made our way along the ancestral trail. We'd recently moved to the area, drawn by the pristine wilderness and the promise of endless hiking opportunities. The trail system wound through what locals called the Old Territory, thousands of acres of protected land that held the remnants of indigenous settlements dating back centuries. Isabella had always been different. She possessed what she called sensitivity, an ability to sense things others couldn't. I'd learned to trust her intuitions over our 8 years of marriage, though I approached such matters with scientific skepticism. As a geologist, I prefer explanations grounded in measurable reality. The day started normally enough. We packed light, just water, trail mix, and basic first aid supplies for what was supposed to be a 3-hour hike. The August heat had kept most other hikers away, leaving us alone on the narrow dirt path that wound through ancient hardwood forest. The first sign something was wrong came about 2 miles in. Isabella stopped abruptly, her hand tightening on her walking stick. I nearly collided with her. "Something's not right," she said, her voice tight. Her face had lost its color, and I noticed goosebumps on her arms despite the heat. I scanned our surroundings. The forest looked perfectly normal, towering oaks and maples creating a dense canopy overhead, undergrowth thick with ferns and mountain laurel. A few birds called in the distance, and insects buzzed in the humid air. "What do you feel?" I asked, having learned not to dismiss her sensations. She shook her head slowly, eyes unfocused. "It's like pressure. Like the air is thick with something angry. We shouldn't be here." I checked our GPS coordinates against the trail map. We were approaching an area marked with historical significance, one of the many burial grounds that dotted these hills. "We could turn back," I offered. Isabella squared her shoulders. "No, I'm probably just being silly. Let's keep going." That decision would prove to be a terrible mistake. We continued up the trail, but something had changed. The forest felt different, though I struggled to identify exactly how. The bird calls had grown fewer and more distant. The air seemed heavier, as if the oxygen content had dropped. Isabella walked closer to me than before, her usual trail confidence notably diminished. I found myself checking our surroundings more frequently, though I couldn't have said what I was looking for. About 100 yards further, I felt it, a sensation like standing too close to a fire, centered between my shoulder blades. I rolled my shoulders, trying to shake it off, but the feeling intensified. "Are you okay?" Isabella asked, noticing my discomfort. "Just a weird burning sensation on my back," I replied, reaching awkwardly to try to touch the spot. Isabella's face went pale. "We need to leave. Now." The urgency in her voice triggered something primal in my brain, an instinct that bypassed rational thought and screamed danger. We turned back, no longer concerned with maintaining a measured hiking pace. The burning on my back intensified with every step, as if someone was holding a hot iron against my skin. Sweat rolled down my face, but I couldn't tell if it was from exertion or pain. The trek back seemed to take 3 times as long as our inbound journey, but our GPS later showed we actually moved faster. The forest had fallen completely silent except for our labored breathing and the sound of our boots on the trail. When we finally reached our car, I practically threw myself into the driver's seat. Isabella's hand shook as she buckled her seatbelt. I backed out of the small gravel parking area with more speed than was wise, sending stones flying. Neither of us spoke during the drive home. The burning on my back had become almost unbearable. "Take off your shirt," Isabella commanded as soon as we entered our house. Her voice held none of its usual gentleness. I complied, wincing as the fabric pulled away from my skin. Isabella gasped. 3 angry red lines ran from my shoulder blades to my lower back, as if something with massive claws had raked across my skin. The marks were raised and hot to the touch, but they hadn't broken the skin. "Don't move," Isabella said, hurrying to the spare room where she kept what she called her spiritual supplies. I heard her rummaging through drawers and cabinets. She returned with a bundle of white sage, a lighter, and a small bottle of oil that smelled of lavender and something else I couldn't identify. Her hands were steady now, her fear replaced by focused determination. "This might feel strange," she warned, lighting the sage bundle. The pungent smoke filled our kitchen as she began what I recognized as a smudging ritual, something she'd learned from her grandmother but had rarely felt the need to use. The smoke swirled around me in ways that seemed to defy natural air currents. Isabella murmured words in a language I didn't understand, her voice taking on a resonant quality I'd never heard before. When she applied the oil to the marks on my back, the burning sensation intensified for a moment before suddenly disappearing. I watched in the bathroom mirror as the angry red lines faded to nothing, leaving my skin unmarked. "What just happened?" I asked, my scientific mind struggling to process what I'd witnessed. Isabella's face was grim. "Something followed us out of those woods. Something that didn't want us there. The incident should have been enough to keep me away from those trails permanently. For almost a year, it was. I focused on other hiking areas, places without the weight of history pressing down like a physical force. But the old territory called to me. As a geologist, I'd been mapping indigenous quarry sites in the region, and some of the most significant deposits lay along those ancient trails. My research suffered from my inability to access these areas. So on August 15, 2021, I made a decision that I would come to regret deeply. I returned to the ancestral trail, this time alone. Isabella refused to accompany me, and in retrospect, her wisdom far exceeded mine. I chose a different section of trail, one that passed several documented burial mounds. These earthen structures rose from the forest floor like ancient sentinels, their purpose and significance still debated by archaeologists. I brought proper research gear this time, sample bags, measuring tools, and a high-resolution camera to document the quarry sites. The day was cooler than my previous visit, with high clouds diffusing the summer sun. I made good progress, stopping occasionally to photograph interesting geological features and mark waypoints on my GPS. The first burial mound appeared about 2 miles in, a perfectly formed hemisphere rising about 12 feet above the forest floor. Generations of leaf fall had softened its edges, but its artificial nature was unmistakable. As I raised my camera to photograph the structure, something caught my eye, a figure standing atop the mound. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form seeming to waver like heat distortion above hot pavement. I lowered the camera, but when I looked directly at the mound, nothing was there. The sensation of being observed grew stronger with every step. The feeling wasn't subtle, it was as if dozens of eyes were tracking my movements, watching from every shadow and behind every tree. I tried to focus on my work, documenting the quarry sites and collecting small samples of the local stone. But my hands shook as I wrote in my field notebook, and twice I dropped my GPS unit while trying to mark waypoints. The silence of the forest grew oppressive. No birds called. No insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the leaves unnaturally still. About a mile past the first burial mound, I heard it, a whistle, clear and musical, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. The sound wasn't natural, it had a distinctly human quality, forming what seemed to be a simple melody of 3 ascending notes. I froze, listening intently. The whistle came again, closer this time, from a different direction. A chill ran down my spine despite the summer heat. Common sense said another hiker must be nearby, though I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. Some remnant of self-preservation urged me to leave immediately, but academic curiosity won out. I whistled back, mimicking the 3-note pattern. The response was immediate and terrifying. A rock the size of my fist shot past my head, missing by inches and striking a nearby tree with enough force to leave a visible mark in the bark. The projectile's speed and trajectory made it clear this was no natural occurrence. Someone or something had thrown it with deadly intent. I ran. The forest seemed to come alive around me. More rocks flew past, striking trees and the ground near my feet. Branches snapped and cracked as if something large was moving parallel to my course, keeping pace effortlessly. The whistling continued, now coming from multiple directions at once. The simple 3-note melody had transformed into something complex and disturbing, overlapping whistles that created dissonant harmonies no human throat could produce. I abandoned the trail, cutting directly downhill toward where I thought my car was parked. Branches whipped at my face, and twice I nearly fell on the steep terrain. The sounds pursued me, whistling, cracking branches, and now something else, voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize, seemingly emanating from the air around me. My lungs burned and my legs trembled, but terror drove me forward. The voices grew louder, their unintelligible words taking on an angry, chanting quality. The air temperature dropped dramatically, creating clouds of vapor with each desperate breath. Something brushed against my back, a touch like ice-cold fingers, and I stumbled, falling hard on the leaf-covered ground. I scrambled to my feet, leaving my backpack and research materials behind. The final 100 yards to my car passed in a blur of panic. I fumbled with my keys, nearly dropping them before managing to unlock the door. As I slammed it shut and started the engine, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror, a tall, dark figure standing at the forest's edge. It seemed to shift and change as I watched, its form refusing to resolve into anything recognizable. I drove away so fast my tires threw gravel, and I didn't slow down until I reached the main highway. That night, unable to sleep, I began researching the area's history. Local historical society records revealed a pattern of similar incidents dating back to the earliest European settlements. Hikers reported being chased from the woods by unseen entities. Surveyors described equipment malfunctions and inexplicable phenomena near the burial mounds. Several people had gone missing in the area over the years, their disappearances never explained. The indigenous history proved harder to uncover. The tribe that once lived here had been forcibly relocated in the 1830s, but fragments of their oral tradition survived. They spoke of guardian spirits that protected sacred sites, of beings that could shift between forms, and of boundaries that humans crossed at their peril. Most interesting were the warnings about whistling in the woods. According to several accounts, whistling was believed to attract the attention of certain spirits, not all of them benevolent. Some stories suggested that mimicking spirit sounds was particularly dangerous, as it could be interpreted as a challenge or mockery. I found myself going down increasingly obscure research paths, reading academic papers on archaeoacoustics, the study of sound in archaeological contexts. Several researchers had documented unusual acoustic properties around burial mounds, including inexplicable sound reflections and infrasonic frequencies that could induce anxiety and disorientation. The scientific part of my mind tried to rationalize what I'd experienced. Perhaps the burial mound's construction created unusual acoustic effects. Maybe the patterns of infrasound could explain the feelings of being watched, the anxiety, even the visual distortions. But none of these explanations could account for everything: the claw marks on my back the previous year, the precisely thrown rocks, the voices speaking an unknown language, the figure that seemed to defy physical form. A week after the incident, I received an unexpected visitor. An elderly man appeared at my office at the university, introducing himself as a member of the tribe that had once called these lands home. He said he'd heard about my research in the area and felt compelled to speak with me. "Those places you're studying," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk, "they're not just burial grounds. They're doorways." He spoke for over an hour, sharing stories passed down through generations. According to his people's traditions, certain locations served as boundaries not just between the physical and spiritual worlds, but between different levels of reality itself. The guardians you encountered, he said, they're not evil. They're protective. Those places hold knowledge and power that we've forgotten how to use safely. The guardians keep people away for their own protection. When I showed him my research notes and described my experiences, he nodded as if confirming something. You're lucky, he said simply. They gave you warnings. First the marks, then the rocks. The next warning might be your last. Before leaving, he placed a small leather pouch on my desk. If you must return to those woods, and I strongly advise against it, carry this. But know that it's not a shield. It's more like a letter of introduction. Whether they choose to honor it is up to them. I never opened the pouch, but sometimes late at night, I swear I can hear it whistle. 3 years have passed since my encounters in the old territory. I've shifted my research focus to less contentious areas, studying geological formations that don't overlap with sacred sites. The leather pouch sits in my desk drawer, untouched. Isabella's sensitivity to the paranormal has grown stronger. She says the encounters opened something in her, expanded her awareness in ways she's still learning to understand. Sometimes she wakes in the night, speaking words in a language neither of us knows. The marks on my back never returned, but I carry other reminders. My research camera, abandoned during my flight through the forest, was found by another hiker 2 weeks later. The memory card contained hundreds of photos I hadn't taken, images of trees, rocks, and burial mounds shot from impossible angles, as if the photographer had been floating above the ground or standing in places that didn't physically exist. Most disturbing were the audio files. Though I hadn't used the camera's video function, somehow it had recorded sound. Hours of whistling, layered in complex harmonies that professional musicians tell me shouldn't be possible to produce naturally. I've received other warnings too. Occasionally, I find small rocks on my office desk or in my car, rocks that match the mineral composition of samples from the quarry sites, appearing in locked rooms and sealed vehicles. The elderly man never returned, and when I tried to find him through tribal contacts, no one seemed to know who he was. The leather pouch he gave me remains a mystery. Tribal experts say its design doesn't match any known traditional patterns. Sometimes, on clear nights when the moon is full, I hear whistling from the woods behind our house, 3 notes, ascending. I don't whistle back anymore. I've learned that some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed, some knowledge isn't meant to be uncovered. The ancient peoples who built those mounds understood something we've forgotten, that the world is larger and stranger than our modern minds can comprehend. They knew that some places serve as bridges between worlds, and that guardians exist to maintain those boundaries. I still hike, but never alone, and never in the old territory. When I pass others heading toward those trails, I want to warn them. But I remember how I would have reacted to such warnings before my experiences, so I stay silent. The woods hold their secrets, and the guardians keep their watch. Sometimes, respect means knowing when to walk away, leaving the mysteries of the ancient world undisturbed. And if you're ever hiking in old woods, and you hear whistling on the trail ahead, don't whistle back. Turn around, walk away, and don't look back. Some calls aren't meant to be answered. The heat shimmer rose from the hood of Michael's old Jeep Cherokee as we finally reached the trailhead. We'd been driving for hours, the paved roads giving way to gravel, then to rutted Forest Service tracks that tested the vehicle's suspension. Central Oregon's remote wilderness stretched in every direction, endless waves of pine-covered mountains beneath a merciless August sun. I was 19 that summer, young enough to believe in my own immortality but old enough to recognize the vastness of our isolation. My companions were Trevor and Kevin, friends since high school who shared my appetite for adventure and my complete lack of real backcountry experience. The trailhead marker was weathered almost to illegibility, its wooden surface scarred by decades of harsh winters and summer sun. Below the official trail name, someone had carved a warning, "The old ways still work." We laughed it off as typical backwoods graffiti. According to the map, we should hit Blackwater Lake by tomorrow afternoon, Trevor said, adjusting his oversized pack. He'd borrowed most of his gear from his older brother, a former Marine who tried to talk us out of this trip. 3 days round trip, easy. None of us had any way of knowing that easy would turn into something else entirely, or that our planned 3-day excursion would become a nightmare that would haunt us for years to come. The first few hours were exactly what we'd imagined, tough hiking but beautiful scenery, the kind of adventure young men dream about. We stopped occasionally to check our map against landmarks, confident in our navigation despite our inexperience. It wasn't until late afternoon that I first noticed something odd. The forest seemed to change character subtly. The trees grew closer together, their branches creating deeper shadows. The birdsong that had accompanied our hike began to fade, replaced by a silence that felt almost purposeful. Anyone else notice how quiet it's gotten? Kevin asked, voicing my thoughts. Trevor checked his GPS unit. Signal's getting spotty too. Might be the terrain. We pushed on, wanting to make our planned campsite before dark. None of us wanted to admit that the landmarks we were seeing didn't quite match our map. The sun set with unnatural speed, as if someone had dimmed a giant light. We made camp in a small clearing, our tent lights creating isolated bubbles in the gathering darkness. The silence had become absolute, no wind in the trees, no nocturnal animals, not even insects. "This isn't right," Kevin said quietly as we heated our freeze-dried meals. "There should be more noise." Trevor tried to lighten the mood. Maybe all the critters are at a forest party we weren't invited to. But his joke fell flat in the heavy air. We ate quickly and turned in early, exhausted from the day's hike. I drifted off to uneasy dreams filled with static and strange mechanical sounds. The scream woke us all simultaneously, a high, keening sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We scrambled out of our tents, headlamps casting frantic beams into the darkness. "What the hell was that?" Trevor's voice cracked. The sound came again, but different this time, lower, almost mechanical, like metal grinding against metal. It lasted for perhaps 30 seconds before fading into silence. None of us slept much after that. Dawn brought no relief. The morning sky was overcast, the sun a pale disk barely visible through the cloud cover. We packed up quickly, eager to leave the strange clearing behind. But something had changed. The trail we'd followed and had vanished, replaced by thick undergrowth that showed no sign of human passage. Trevor's GPS displayed obviously incorrect coordinates, showing us somehow miles from where we should have been. "This is impossible," he muttered, checking and rechecking the unit. We couldn't have wandered that far off trail. We picked a direction that seemed right and started walking. Hours passed, and the forest grew denser, the trees pressing closer together until we had to squeeze between them. The air became thick and humid, despite being in an area known for its dry climate. By late afternoon, we were officially lost. Our water supplies were holding steady, and we had enough food for several more days, but the realization of our situation began to sink in. We were far off any marked trail, in a section of wilderness that somehow felt wrong on a fundamental level. Then we found the first artifact. It was Kevin who spotted it, a glint of metal half buried in the forest floor. He dug it out with a stick, an old telegraph key, its brass surface green with age but still recognizable. The discovery seemed odd but not particularly significant until we found more items, pieces of old machinery, tools, and eventually entire structures. We'd stumbled into what remained of a mining town, though it appeared on none of our maps. The buildings were little more than foundations and collapsed walls, but they provided the first real landmarks we'd seen in days. "Look at this," Trevor called, examining a partially standing wall. Cables ran through the rotting wood, disappearing into the ground. They looked far too modern for an abandoned mining town. Kevin found a metal plate with faded lettering, Department of Defense Restricted Area. The date stamp read 1952. What was the military doing out here? I wondered aloud. The sun was setting again, our fourth night in the wilderness. We made camp near the ruins, hoping they might help us get our bearings in the morning. None of us wanted to admit how the old structures made us feel, as if we were being watched by something that lurked just at the edge of perception. That's when the sounds began. The clicking started so gradually that at first, I thought I was imagining it. A steady tap, 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 like an old telegraph key being operated by an unseen hand. I poked my head out of the tent to find Trevor and Kevin already awake, their faces pale in the dying firelight. The sound had a pattern to it, a rhythm that seemed almost meaningful. None of us spoke, afraid to break whatever strange spell had fallen over the camp. The clicks grew louder, more insistent, and were joined by other sounds, the whir of machinery, the hum of electrical current. Then came the transmission. It started as static, like an old radio trying to find a frequency. But beneath the white noise, we could hear music, orchestral pieces playing in fragments, overlaid with what sounded like NASA communications. A man's voice broke through occasionally, speaking words we couldn't quite understand. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, filling the air with an impossible symphony of technology and music. The static would build to a crescendo, then drop to silence, only to begin again with different combinations of sounds. Our fire dimmed to embers, and the overcast sky blocked any light from the stars or moon. We were surrounded by absolute darkness and these impossible sounds. I found myself holding my breath, straining to make sense of the transmissions. The male voice seemed to be counting or reciting coordinates, but in a language that wasn't quite English. The music would swell, drowning out the words, then fade to loud bursts of static and high-pitched beeping. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing against us like a physical force. The gravel beneath our feet seemed to vibrate in sync with the strange frequencies. My hands trembled as I gripped the tent fabric, my entire body resonating with the otherworldly broadcast. The transmission lasted for exactly 37 minutes. Trevor had been obsessively checking his watch. When it ended, the silence felt like a physical blow. None of us slept. We sat in our tents, listening to each other's ragged breathing, jumping at every small sound. As soon as the first gray light of dawn appeared, we began exploring the ruins more thoroughly. In daylight, we discovered things we'd missed before. The cables we'd noticed led to a partially collapsed tunnel entrance. Above it, barely visible beneath years of weathering, was another metal plate, Project Echo classified. Project Echo was a NASA communication experiment in the 60s, Kevin said. He'd always been interested in space history. They used giant metallic balloons as passive reflectors for radio signals. What would that have to do with a mining town in Oregon? Trevor asked. We found our answer, or at least part of it, in what remained of a small office building. Scattered papers, mostly rotted away, but a few pages remained legible. They described something called Operation Deep Listen, a joint venture between the Department of Defense and NASA to establish communication arrays in remote locations. But what caught our attention was a handwritten note in the margins of one document: the signals aren't coming from space. We didn't wait for nightfall. Something about that note, combined with our experience, had triggered a primal need to escape. We picked a direction and started walking, no longer caring about finding the original trail. The forest seemed different now, more alive somehow, but not in any natural way. The trees creaked even when there was no wind, and shadows moved in ways that defied the sun's position. Several times we heard fragments of sound, brief bursts of static or single musical notes that cut off abruptly. Late in the afternoon, we heard something moving parallel to our course through the dense undergrowth. Whatever it was large and seemed to be pacing us. Occasionally we caught glimpses of movement, a dark shape that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. The sun was setting again when we finally found a Forest Service road. We followed it at a near run until we reached a ranger station. The ranger's face when we emerged from the woods suggested we looked as bad as we felt. When we tried to tell him about the mining town and the sounds, he stopped us. That area's been closed off for decades, he said. There's nothing out there anymore. But something in his expression suggested he knew more than he was saying. We never made another trip together after that. Trevor joined the Marines like his brother and was killed in Iraq 3 years later. Kevin moved to Seattle and stopped answering calls. I stayed in Oregon, but I never went back to those mountains. The dreams started a few months after our return. They're always the same. I'm standing in that mining town at night, but the buildings are intact, lights glowing in the windows. The transmission plays, but in the dreams, I can understand the words. They're coordinates, but not for any location on Earth. I've researched Project Echo and Operation Deep Listen extensively. Most records are still classified, but I've found hints in declassified documents about experiments with alternative communication methods and non-traditional signal sources. Last week, I received a package from Trevor's family, items they found while sorting through his things after his death. Among them was his old GPS unit from our trip. When I turned it on, it displayed a series of coordinates I didn't recognize, and in the background, very faintly, I could hear clicking. I've spent years trying to understand what happened to us in those woods. The more I dig, the stranger the story becomes. I've found connections between that mining town and other sites across the country, places where the military conducted experiments in the 1950s and 60s under the guise of communication research. But it goes deeper than that. The indigenous peoples of the area had legends about places in the mountains where the world was thin, where sounds from other places could bleed through. The miners who first settled the area reported hearing strange music and voices coming from deep in their tunnels. The military didn't choose that location randomly. They found something there, something they tried to communicate with using technology they barely understood. The transmissions we heard were recordings or equipment malfunctions, they were responses. Sometimes late at night, when I'm alone, I can still hear fragments of that transmission. The orchestral music, the static, the voice reciting impossible coordinates. But now I understand what we really heard that night, a conversation between worlds, a message meant for something that was never human. Trevor knew it too. In his last letter home, he wrote about hearing similar sounds in the Iraqi desert, about coordinates that didn't match any earthly location. He believed what we encountered wasn't just a government experiment gone wrong, it was first contact of a kind we weren't prepared to understand. The mining town still exists, hidden in those remote mountains. The equipment still runs, powered by something that doesn't need electricity. And on certain nights, if you're lost in those woods, you might hear the transmission, a message from somewhere beyond our understanding, waiting for someone to answer. But if you do hear it, don't listen too carefully. Don't try to understand the coordinates or decipher the voice in the static. Some messages aren't meant for human ears, and some answers are better left undiscovered. Because sometimes, when you stare into the static long enough, something stares back. The Florida heat lingered even after sunset, turning the air into a thick soup of humidity and mosquitoes. I'd been night riding these trails for months, finding peace in the solitude and challenge of navigating the twisted paths through the darkness. My setup was solid, a 2000 lumen floodlight mounted on my handlebars for broad coverage, and a focused 1500 lumen spotlight on my helmet for distance visibility. The Cypress Creek Trail system wound through old-growth swampland, a maze of elevated sandy paths built on ancient shell middens left by indigenous peoples thousands of years ago. During the day, the trails bustled with riders and hikers. But at night, it transformed into something else entirely, a primordial landscape where the boundary between present and past grew thin. That September evening started like any other night ride. The air was heavy with the scent of decaying vegetation and blooming night jasmine. My tires cut silent tracks through the sugar sand as I navigated the familiar turns, the beam of my lights carving a tunnel of visibility through the darkness. The first sign that something was different came about 3 miles in, where the trail dipped close to a cypress dome. My lights caught something unusual on the trail ahead, hundreds of tiny green sparkles scattered across the sand like emeralds catching moonlight. I slowed my bike, curiosity overriding my usual momentum. The trail here was typically pure sugar sand, with occasional patches of organic matter from the surrounding vegetation. These gleaming points of light made no sense in this environment. Probably some kids dropped something, I muttered to myself, the sound of my voice swallowed by the dense foliage surrounding the trail. Still, something about the way the lights sparkled set off warning bells in my subconscious. I brought my bike to a complete stop, planting one foot in the sand. The sparkles remained, their emerald glow seeming to pulse slightly in my LED beams. Against my better judgment, I swung my leg over the frame and stepped forward to investigate. The realization hit me like a physical blow. What I'd mistaken for crystals or dropped glitter were eyes, hundreds of wolf spider eyes reflecting my lights back at me. The trail was carpeted with them, their bodies nearly invisible against the dark sand until my movement caused them to shift slightly. These weren't ordinary wolf spiders. The species common to Florida trails rarely grew larger than a $50 coin. These monsters were easily 3 times that size, their legs spanning the width of my palm. And they were all facing me, as if my arrival had interrupted some sort of arachnid gathering. My heart hammered against my ribs as I slowly backed toward my bike. The spiders remained motionless, their eyes still fixed on me like tiny emerald stars. In all my years of night riding, I'd never seen anything like this congregation. A sound from the surrounding woods froze me in place, a soft rustling that seemed to circle my position. The spiders nearest to the trail's edge began moving in unison, turning to face the sound like an audience responding to a conductor. I mounted my bike with trembling hands, trying to keep my movements smooth and deliberate. The rustling grew louder, accompanied now by a sound like dry leaves scratching against bark. The spiders had begun to move, creating complex patterns in the sand as they shifted position. That's when I noticed something that turned my blood to ice. The spiders were forming concentric circles, with the outermost ring facing the woods and the inner ring still watching me. It felt coordinated, purposeful, as if they were responding to some unseen signal. I pushed off, trying to find a line through the spider-covered trail that wouldn't require running over too many of them. The thought of feeling their bodies crush beneath my tires made my skin crawl. As I picked up speed, my helmet light caught something ahead, another pair of reflected eyes, these much larger and positioned low to the ground. My first thought was wildlife, probably a raccoon or a possum drawn by the commotion. But as I watched, the eyes began to rise, smoothly and steadily, until they were level with my own. Then they kept rising, reaching a height that seemed impossible for any local wildlife. The distance between us closed rapidly as I continued forward, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. The eyes were set too wide apart for a deer, too high for a bear, and the movement was all wrong, smooth and deliberate, like something being hydraulically lifted. When the creature was about 30 yards ahead, my spotlight finally illuminated more than just its eyes. The body was massive, covered in coarse brown fur that seemed to absorb rather than reflect my light. Its proportions were wrong, too tall, too thin, with limbs that joined at unexpected angles. For a fraction of a second, it stood its ground, and I caught a glimpse of something that defied explanation. Then it turned with impossible speed and vanished into the woods, leaving only the sound of cracking branches and a glimpse of that brown fur disappearing into the darkness. Self-preservation kicked in, and I accelerated to full speed, no longer concerned about the spiders or trail hazards. The sound of my tires in the sand seemed impossibly loud, matched only by my ragged breathing and pounding heart. Something kept pace with me through the woods, moving parallel to the trail. Branches snapped and palm fronds rustled with its passage, but I couldn't spare a glance away from my line. At that speed, any mistake could be catastrophic. The spiders had vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving the trail eerily empty. But now other eyes began to appear in the woods, pairs of reflected lights at various heights, some blinking out as I passed, others seeming to follow my progress. The thing running parallel to me was breathing now, deep, with sounds that no Florida wildlife should make. It seemed to be hurting me, subtly influencing my direction through strategic appearances and sounds. I made it back to the trailhead in record time, not slowing until my tires hit pavement. Only then did I allow myself to stop, legs shaking so badly I could barely dismount. The parking lot was empty except for my truck, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As I loaded my bike with trembling hands, I recalled conversations with local old-timers about these trails. They spoke of the swamp which, not the cartoonish figure from tourist trap gift shops, but something older and darker. Indigenous legends told of a being that walked between worlds, accompanied by creatures that defied natural law. Early settlers reported encounters with something they called the Long Walker, described as a towering figure that appeared at night, surrounded by swarms of spiders. More recently, there were stories of military operations in the area during the 1960s, classified research into local phenomena that was abruptly terminated after a series of unexplained incidents. The old-timers said they were trying to track something that lived in the swamp, something that could change its shape and size at will. At home, I examined my gear while still amped on adrenaline. My tire treads were packed with sand, but something else caught my eye, strands of coarse brown hair snagged in my pedals. The fibers were unlike anything I'd seen before, too thick for deer or bear, with an internal structure that seemed almost crystalline when I examined them under my desk lamp. More disturbing were the patterns of tiny footprints preserved in the sand coating my tires, perfect concentric circles of wolf spider tracks, each ring oriented in a different direction. The formation couldn't have been random. I tried researching wolf spider behavior, finding nothing that could explain what I'd witnessed. Their eyes shouldn't have reflected green. Wolf spider eye shine is typically blue-white. And while they can gather in groups, they're solitary hunters that don't demonstrate coordinated behavior. The hair samples provided no answers either. When I tried to photograph them the next morning, they had degraded into a fine, iridescent powder that disappeared at the slightest touch. I still ride those trails, but never alone and never after dark. Sometimes, when conditions are right, on humid nights when the moon is dark and the air feels charged with electricity, I see tiny green sparkles in my peripheral vision. They vanish when I turn to look, like stars winking out at dawn. The longtime locals say the trails have changed since that night. The spiders are different now, larger, more numerous, and showing signs of coordinated behavior that biologists can't explain. They gather in circles on the trail after dark, their eyes reflecting green instead of the usual blue-white. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, people report hearing something large moving through the swamp. Whatever it is walks upright but leaves no tracks, and is always accompanied by swarms of spiders moving in perfect geometric patterns. I've never seen the creature again, but I dream about it often. In my dreams, it stands at its full height, towering above the cypress canopy. The spiders move around its feet in intricate designs, like electrons orbiting an atomic nucleus. And its eyes, those impossible eyes, reflect not just light, but something deeper, something that suggests the creature I encountered was merely a glimpse of something far larger and stranger than our minds can comprehend. The old-timers say the swamp keeps its own counsel, that some things aren't meant to be understood by outsiders. Maybe they're right. But on dark nights when I hear the wind in the cypress trees, I can't help but wonder about what really lives in those ancient swamps, and what it means when the spiders gather in circles, waiting for something only they can sense. Local environmental officials have noticed changes in the area since that night. Wildlife patterns have shifted, with traditional predator-prey relationships breaking down in ways that defy explanation. Trail cameras capture images of conventional animals moving in unconventional ways, deer walking on their hind legs, raccoons gathering in geometric formations, birds flying in impossible patterns. The wolf spiders have continued to evolve. Recent specimens show unexpected physical changes, increased size, modified structures that reflect green light instead of blue-white, and complex social behaviors never before documented in arachnids. Several university research teams have attempted to study the phenomenon, but their equipment consistently malfunctions in ways that can't be explained. The military has renewed its interest in the area, though they won't say why. Black helicopters occasionally hover over the cypress domes, and unmarked vehicles patrol the access roads at night. The old research stations, abandoned since the 1960s, have been quietly reactivated. Some locals claim the creature I encountered was just the beginning, a scout or precursor for something larger. They point to patterns in the spider gatherings, saying the formations are becoming more complex, more purposeful, as if building towards some culmination. I've started mapping the spider circles, plotting their locations and configurations over time. A pattern is emerging, but its significance eludes me. The formations seem to radiate outward from a central point deep in the swamp, like ripples spreading from a stone dropped in still water. Whatever dwells in those swamps seems to be stirring, reaching out through its arachnid servants to prepare for something. The spiders are its eyes, its sensors, gathering data for some purpose we can only guess at. The old-timers say when the spiders gather in perfect circles, it means something is about to change. They say the long walker appears when boundaries between worlds grow thin, when ancient things prepare to cross thresholds we can't perceive. I still have the coordinates where I encountered the creature marked on my GPS. Sometimes I'm tempted to go back, to seek answers to the questions that haunt my dreams. But then I remember those eyes rising in the darkness, that impossible height, and the way the spiders moved with such terrible purpose. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some thresholds better left uncrossed. But on quiet nights, when the air grows thick with humidity and possibility, I can't help but wonder what's really watching us from the darkness between the trees, and what happens when it finally decides to step fully into our world.